Harper Audio presents The Frenchman, created by Chris Carter, a novelization by Elizabeth Hand, performed by Bill Smitrovich. It comes like this: muted cries, the sound of panting, a crimson wave lapping at his feet, unblinking eyes that will not turn away, the soft pressure of a mouth at his groin, the crimson waves crashing higher and higher still until he can taste it in his mouth. Bile and copper, blood streaming from the corners of his eyes, and the voice he hears is his own. The screams are his own, though the blood always is not. It comes like this. He comes like this, and afterwards is left gasping on the shore, the tide receding, and nothing left but that taste in his mouth and a trace of blood on his palms. He stood beyond the alley, shoulders hunched against an icy February rain that glazed the broken sidewalk, making a lurid scarlet beacon of the club's flickering neon sign. The Ruby Tip, Seattle's hottest. Live girls until 2 a.m. For the 100th time he read the words, mouth parted slightly so that his upper teeth bit into his lip. He grimaced, as though tasting something rank, then tugged his baseball cap down tight against the rain, crossed the alley, and shoved his way through the heavy steel door. Industrial music pounded down the dark hallway, the jackhammer beat keeping time with the blood thrumming in his head. The reek of pine disinfectant warred with cigarette smoke and perfume, the fainter, spoiled sense of arousal and release. On either side of the corridor doors loomed, alternating, red and green. A muffled thunk as one of the doors opened and closed. He looked up, saw a young woman with chic dark hair and heavy leather trench coat striding toward him, her high-heeled boots making a hollow sound on the linoleum. Other doors opened. Men jostled soundlessly past each other, their glances cold as rain, washing over the girl. She shook her hair back, mouth tight, and did not meet their predatory gaze. For a moment the man in the baseball cap stood there, watching her as she passed. Then he quickly turned and disappeared behind one of the green doors. The woman continued on her way, hands thrust deep into her pockets. At the ticket desk, she gave a perfunctory wave to the young man inside. Sammy, a good kid, didn't hassle the girls, did his best to weed out the weirdos when he could. "I'm off," she announced. Sammy slid another roll of quarters into the cash drawer, lifted his chin to acknowledge her. "Yep." He watched her sidle out the door, holding it open for a slight figure in rain-soaked jacket and tight jeans who hurried inside, her head tilted so as to avoid the eyes of the patrons milling around inside. "Hey, Tuesday!" Sammy smiled, self-consciously stroked the goatee he'd been working on for 2 weeks now. "How's it going?" Tuesday shrugged. "What can I say? I'm here." "All righty." Sammy swiveled in his chair to check out the next customer. "Later." Tuesday moved with practiced haste and hauteur down the corridor, elbowing past the men, who paused to stare at her, finally pushing open the door of the dancer's dressing room. A haze of smoke met her, and the throb of a 9-inch nail song from behind another door that led on stage. A pair of battered sofas were shoved against the walls beneath peeling music posters, and a flyer from the Puget Sound Women's Health Care Center. 3 dancers in work gear leather bustier, candy pink baby doll dress, black satin tap pants and bra, sprawled companionably on the couches, smoking and flipping through the latest rash of magazines brought in by Sammy. They looked up as Tuesday crossed the clothes rack and began pulling out her night's costume. "Hey, Tues, your car running better? There's some coffee, I just made it." Tuesday nodded, flashed a smile as she hung up her wet jacket and began peeling off a cable-knit sweater. "Thanks. Yeah, it was just an electrical glitch. The mechanic fixed it. Only cost $40, thank God." Behind her, the stage door flew open, and a willowy blonde in red bikini and matching push-up bra stalked in. her face damp, golden tendrils plastered across her forehead. "Hey, Calamity," Tuesday greeted her. "How's it going?" "Okay." Calamity looked over her shoulder as she hurried to the far wall where a payphone hung alongside a scrawled list of telephone numbers. "I want to make sure the babysitter hasn't left yet." She shoved a quarter into the slot, punched in her number, and leaned on the phone, wincing as she pushed her long hair from her eyes. "Hey, Tuesday, that weird French guy's back." Tuesday unhooked her plain white bra and pulled on a more provocative one, demi-cups and black lace edging her breasts. "The guy with the poetry?" Calamity nodded. "Yeah, and—" "Oh, hi, honey. It's Mommy. Is Cindy still there? Can I talk to her?" Tuesday's face creased with sympathy as she watched the woman on the phone. She pulled off her jeans, pulled on a black G-string, then strode to where a cheap floor-length mirror listed on the wall by the stage door. Tuesday tugged her fingers through her thick hair, teasing it back from her face, then expertly ran cerise lipstick across her mouth, touched up the corners of her eyes with liner and mascara. She gave the mirror a parting moo, then turned and walked through the door onto the dance floor. The girls called it the Cage, an area roughly 20 by 20 feet square, blindingly lit by colored strobe lights that would, without warning, darken to violet or the sullen red of banked embers. Around its perimeter was a series of small square windows. Through these could be glimpsed shadowy figures crouching or standing in their dark booths as they watched the girls on stage with dull, flattened eyes. Tuesday preened, half closing her eyes and licking her lips seductively as she ran her fingers through her hair, whirling to give first one window, then the next, a view of her breasts, straining from her push-up bra, the smooth hollow of her belly curving down to her pubis. Through the dully reflected sheen of black glass, she caught the flicker of eyes here, a mouth there, and her hands dropped down, lingering upon the lacy edges of her bra. For a moment she shut her eyes, feigning ecstasy, then opened them. In front of her was one of the observation windows. A figure stood behind it. The Frenchman. He was there 2 or 3 times a week, always wearing the same dark baseball cap and dark glasses, always bearing the same offering for the women inside the cage. Piece of paper scrawled with foreign words. "French," Calamity said, though none of the girls ever got the chance to figure out what the message actually said. "Just as well," Brittany snorted once, when Calamity expressed curiosity about him. "Fucking weirdo. What else do you need to know?" He was there now in front of Tuesday, holding up a handwritten piece of loose leaf against the glass. Tuesday smiled at him, a smile that was close to a sneer, then shimmied right up to his window, taunting him. Fingers tracing the front of her G-string, then moving slowly up between her thighs, across her taut abdomen to where her breasts threatened to spill from her bra. She toyed with the snap there, starting to open it, head thrown back, eyes closed just for an instant. But when she opened them again, he was gone. Backstage in the dressing room, Brittany put the finishing touches to her makeup, then flounced out into the cage. Behind her, Calamity buttoned her flannel shirt, shrugged into a shapeless wool sweater, and pulled on her Doc Martens. She glanced at her watch, 1:10, and swore under her breath. She promised the sitter she'd be back by 12:30. "Gotta fly," she called out to the other girls, sweeping up her backpack and parka. "See ya." Just then Sammy poked his head through the door. "Hey," he said, cocking a thumb at Calamity. "You've got a private." Calamity shook her head. "I'm off," she said, zipping her parka. "Sorry." $200 for 10 minutes. The girls on the couch turned to stare first at Sammy, then Calamity. "Well, shit," Calamity said after a moment. "I better call the sitter." And she began to get undressed. The private booth is a heated darkness. Smells of copper, of musk, of sweat and damp tobacco and semen. Of sex. Inches from his face, the small square window fogs as his breath blooms upon it. On the other side of the glass writhes a woman. "Do you like to watch me?" The woman drops her hands, snakes them suggestively across her breast. "I know you like to watch me." He says nothing. "Tell me what you want," the woman whispers. She purses her mouth in a little girl pout and half closes her eyes as she sidles up to the window, licking her lips. "Tell me." In the booth, he takes a step backward. His heart is thudding in his chest as he nods, quickly, then begins to mumble, "I want to see you dance. I want to see you dance on the blood-dimmed tide." "You like to watch me, don't you?" He exhales and her body blooms. An explosion of black and crimson caustic flowers opening up as her eyes recede into black pits and her lips peel back from her gums to reveal naked bone, blood oozing from raw stumps where her teeth had been. He pants, sweat trickling into the corners of his mouth. Behind the woman, a faint glister of red forms on the surface of the walls as she cups her breasts and leans forward. Corruption falls away from her. She is young and desirable once more, her mouth a crimson slash. Her creamy thighs opening to him though he no longer sees her. His eyes are riveted by the wall behind her, where the dull gleam of scarlet has become a ribbon, a rivulet, blood purling and then pooling down to the floor, where it runs in an ever-widening stream to lap at the woman's high heels. "You like to watch my body?" she breathes, twirling on one foot so that blood sprays her bare ankle. "I know you like it." His breath comes faster and faster still. His hands begin to shake. He pushes himself closer to the window and his voice trembles as he whispers, the words lost in the darkness. In front of him she is moving faster as well, keeping time with his breathing. She caresses her neck, her shoulder blades, her stomach. "I know you like it. Don't be shy." She arches her back and shakes her head, eyes shut tight as he groans, his mouth struggling to speak. "This is the second death." And the blood comes, a sanguine waterfall that splashes up around her thighs as she dances and he watches her, his voice louder now as he clutches at the window in front of him. "The abominable and the fornicators," he mumbles, though she hears nothing. She looks at him and his mouth does not move. "I know you like it," she repeats, eyelashes sweeping down to hide her gaze as she dips her head, then glances up at him through a fringe of smoke and flame. "I know you like it." He groans and blinks, eyes tearing. From the walls, flames erupt, roaring down and into the room as though blood were tinder. Fuel-soaked paper, hair held above a candle. The lake of blood shimmers and then bursts into a blaze of gold and black and scarlet, blinding. The flames writhe and dance, encircling the woman who moves heedlessly through the fire, even as her skin crackles and curls away. Drops of fat spattering against the window glass as her mouth moves brokenly and he watches her hair turn to ash. Her fingers splayed into twigs that sputter and twist into smoke. His voice roars into nothingness as he gasps and falls backward against a chair, the woman's last words echoing in his ears as flames engulf the room. The stench of blood fills his nostrils as a single tear falls upon his cheek. "I know you like it." Morning struck the city of Seattle, sun instead of its customary fog and rain. On a hillside facing east, Frank Black maneuvered his family's red Cherokee, blinking as light streamed through the dashboard and across his lean face. "I think someone's trying to peek," he announced, smiling as he glanced at his wife in the seat beside him. In her lap, their 6-year-old daughter, Jordan, gasped and clapped her own hands over her mother's, already tightly pressed against her eyes. "No peeking, Mommy." Catherine smiled and shook her head, not moving her fingers from her eyes. "Okay, You tell me when, Jordan." Frank's smile broadened. He eased the car around a curve, passing beneath apple trees that would be full-leafed and flowering come spring, and then onto a broad side street where neat bungalows and carpenter Gothic cottages were scattered like children's toys amid well-kept lawns, box tree hedges, a garden where expired sunflowers still leaned over a trellis. Frank brought the car to a stop at the curb, halfway down the block, behind a moving van. He turned to Jordan, peering up at him from beneath tousled dark curls like her mother's. For a long moment he gave in to the indulgence of looking at them both. He fought the customary surge of anxiety that had dogged him on the long cross-country drive from D.C., fought the stab of fear and horror like the memory of a bad dream, a dream he had finally managed to forget. That was all behind him now. This was a new home, a new life. "Daddy?" Jordan's voice broke his reverie. Frank blinked, looked up to see her squirming impatiently on Catherine's lap. "Now?" Frank laughed and nodded. "Now." "Okay, Mommy," Jordan cried, leaning over to bang on the window. "You can look now." Catherine composed her face into a semblance of dignity, took her hands from her eyes, and gazed out the window. For a moment, Frank watched her anxiously. Then, "Oh, Frank," she exclaimed, elated. "You had it painted." And as she clambered excitedly from the car, Jordan spilling onto the sidewalk after her, he knew that at last everything was going to be all right. "Is this our new house, Daddy?" cried Jordan. "Is this it?" Frank climbed from the car and joined them at the edge of green lawn, nodding. "Our new yellow house." Above the slope of close-trimmed grass and clover gleamed a sunny yellow craftsman-style bungalow, the trim around its windows and dormers glowing white. Leaded glass in the second-story windows sparked prism-like in the morning sun. On the porch, several fuchsias hung in wicker baskets, a gift from the realtor. Catherine gazed at it transported, then began to walk dreamily up the sidewalk. Behind her, Jordan's hand slipped into her father's as they followed her. Inside, the movers had already set the heavier furniture in vaguely homey configurations. Sofa, overstuffed armchairs, Jordan's rocking chair in the living room, wicker end tables and reading lamps in the sunroom, and boxes everywhere else. Frank shook his head, wondering what on earth they could all be filled with. Books, dishes, Jordan's collection of Legos. A few feet away, an old Victorian coat stand leaned forlornly against the wall beside the mirror from Jordan's dresser. He caught a glimpse of himself, trapped within the bright pink and yellow frame, a tall, lean man, his dark hair stitched with gray, eyes deep-set and serious, though not humorless, deep channels etched around his eyes and mouth. It was not a face that smiled easily, but it was a face that compelled trust. A crony of Frank's at the bureau had once quipped that Frank could be a stand-in for the angel Gabriel. "And a mug like that is only good for breaking bad news from the big guy." The remark hadn't stung because they all knew the truth behind it. Most of Frank's jobs had involved being on the receiving end of very bad news indeed. "Oh, Daddy, there they are!" His daughter ran past him, squealing with delight as she recognized a carton with her name on it, and began pulling out stuffed animals. Frank grinned wryly, then edged aside as the moving men came through again, this time carrying the kitchen table. Catherine's voice rang out. "Frank?" When he reached the bedroom, he saw Catherine standing just inside the door with a rapturous expression. "What is it?" he asked softly. She said nothing, only put her arm around his neck and drew him to her. She kissed him deeply, her warmth and the curve of her hands about him as familiar as his own heartbeat. For a moment they lingered there, leaning against the doorframe. Then Frank drew back, just enough that he could stare down into her green eyes and see there what he was looking for. "I'm so happy right now," she whispered. For an instant, tears brightened her gaze. "I think this move was the right thing. I really do, Frank." He nodded, feeling anxiety peel away from him like old paint. "I do too. It feels like home." From outside came a faint thump, a familiar whirring sound. They both turned to stare out the window to where the same boy Frank had seen earlier was whooshing past on his bike, another folded newspaper already in his hand to hit the next front stoop. They watched until he was out of sight, then began to laugh. It was too perfect. It was late afternoon before he finally got around to collecting that newspaper. The sun had dipped behind the hillside, sending long shadows across the lawns and a breath of winter back into the air. Frank picked up the folded paper and was starting back inside when someone hailed him from the neighboring lawn. "Hello there!" He turned and saw a balding man in his late 50s waving his own newspaper, pleasant-faced, with round, amiable features and a bright red cardigan buttoned a little too tightly across an ample stomach. "Hi, Jack Meredith," the man went on, crossing the lawn and beaming. "I guess we're going to be neighbors." Frank Black. The other man took Frank's hand and pumped it welcomingly, then tucked his paper beneath his arm and rocked back on his heels. "So, Frank, where are you folks from?" A twinge of unease flickered through Frank, but he had pushed it down. "We've been in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, he said firmly. "But originally my wife and I are from here in Seattle." Jack Meredith cocked his head. "Oh, yeah? What brings you back?" "Well, we wanted to come home, put down some roots." Meredith nodded approvingly. "Sure, that makes sense." His gaze held Frank's just a fraction of a second too long. "Well, what kind of work you in, Frank?" I'm in kind of a career change." Meredith's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, got anything lined up?" Frank gave him a measuring look, then smiled. "I'm doing some consulting." Oh, yeah. Meredith looked pleased. As Frank walked back to the porch, his neighbor's voice boomed cheerfully behind him. "Hey, Frank, you couldn't have picked a nicer place to come back to." Frank smiled again, then turned his attention to the newspaper in his hand. He slipped off the rubber band, unfolded the paper, and let his eyes rove across it until he found the headline. And stopped. He read the headline, splashed across the top of the page in 1-inch type. "Mother found murdered in home. 5-year-old daughter hid from slayer." Beneath the subheading, the sweet-faced image of a young woman with long blonde hair smiled up at him. "Frank?" On the porch, the screen door creaked open. Catherine stepped out, head tilted curiously as she gazed down at her husband. "Frank, who was that you were—" The words died as he raised his face to the last faint rays of sunlight. His expression taut, eyes kindling as he looked up past her, all but unseeing, and thought, "It never ends. It never ends. It never, ever ends." Early next morning, he found himself outside the Seattle Social Services building. Rain, like smoke in the heavy steel-colored air around him. An odd sensation filled him at the sight of that familiar concrete edifice. Anxiety and anticipation. The memory of too many sleepless nights fueled by bad coffee and worse dreams. For a moment he stood there, staring at the rain-streaked doors, then folded his umbrella and went inside. The third floor was as it had always been, seemingly endless ranks of cubicles, each with its glowing computer screen, men and women whose urgent expressions unexpectedly gave way to ironic laughter, the occasional crackle of a uniformed officer's walkie-talkie. Now and then he paused to read the names on the cubicles, frowning until at last he found what he was looking for. Lieutenant Robert Bletcher proclaimed a small plaque on the wall beside an open door. Homicide. Frank hesitated, then stepped into the doorway. In the room, a tall, formidably built man in a discreet gray suit and a testosterone yellow tie sat behind a large desk, listening as one of 3 detectives read from a computer printout. Bletcher's eyes fixed on the gaunt figure in the doorway. "I think I've just seen a ghost," he said, and got to his feet. A thin smile touched Frank's mouth. "Hey, Bletch." The detective swiveled as the burly lieutenant crossed the room, grabbing Frank's hand and shaking it so happily that Frank had to move quickly to keep from being thrown off balance. "Jesus, what are you doing here, Frank?" Frank shrugged, letting Bletcher guide him into the room. "Well, we moved back to Seattle." Bletcher nodded. "You and Catherine?" "Yeah, we missed the weather." Bletcher turned to the other men, clapping a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Hey, this is Frank Black. He used to work homicide here before I became a big star at the FBI. Frank, Bob Giebelhaus, Pete Norton, Roger Fry." A subdued chorus of greetings, then one of the men, Giebelhaus, leaned across the conference table, eyes narrowing as he stared more closely at Frank. Hey, you're the guy who caught the guy that serial killer who ate his victims. What's his name?" Frank nodded, his face a mask. "Leon Cole Piggott." Giebelhaus snapped his fingers. "Yeah. Hey, I was always curious. How did he prepare them?" The lines around Frank's mouth grew tight. "In a skillet," he said, his expression unreadable. "With potatoes and onions." Giebelhaus snorted with disgusted laughter. "Jesus Christ," he said, turning to share his amusement with the other detectives. "Can you believe that?" Frank gave the three a cool look, then he raised his eyes to Bletcher's. "Got a minute?" he asked in a low voice. Bletcher tipped his head. "Yeah, sure." They stepped out of the office and walked down the hall. They reached the end of the corridor and started down another, this one less crowded with cubicles and foot traffic. Frank glanced around and asked softly, "What about this woman 2 days ago, the one with the little girl?" Bletcher's face darkened. "She was a stripper," he said curtly. "Worked a peep show. It was bloody and cruel." Frank said nothing, only nodded. After a moment he asked, "How's the little girl?" "She's in custody down at DSHS. She witnessed the murder?" Bletcher stopped in front of a fire door. "No, she didn't." He fixed the other man with a hard, wondering stare. "You here looking for work, Frank?" He gazed at Frank expectantly, but his friend said nothing, only stood there, his gaunt face dipped in shadow. A minute passed, then Frank said, "Any chance you could take me down to see the body?" Bletcher had continued to stare at him. Finally, he nodded once. "Come on." In his years with the Bureau, Frank had heard various morgues described as charnel houses, slaughterhouses, laboratories, even cathedrals. Spaces desecrated or sanctified by death, yet retaining still the sense of a place set apart from the profane world, populated by physicians and coroners and medical researchers and, yes, corpses. But to Frank, a morgue was a factory, simple as that. The dead were brought in, their flesh still warm sometimes, their faces still tight with the tales of their dying, bodies clothed and clothing torn or worn or bloodied. But each corpse a book to be opened, a mystery to be solved within spirals of DNA and loops of arteries, viscera, and teeth and fingernails. The dead entered the morgue clothed in their traumas, protected even by their secrets. But when they left, they all looked the same, tagged and cleansed, bagged like so many over-processed bits of gristle and bone. Factories, Frank thought grimly as he followed Bletcher downstairs. This one was no different. The morgue was a vast room, warehouse-sized, illuminated by banks of fluorescent tubes hanging in rows high overhead, so high that the light, when it reached the floor, was scant, faintly greenish, like a sheen of ice on the slick tile. Metal tables rose like islands in an Arctic sea, with here and there a technician or orderly leaning over a pale form and gurneys scattered between them like waiting ships. There was the barely detectable scent of spoiled meat, the lactose smell of refrigerant, and an underlying chemical sweetness, embalming fluid and alcohol and disinfectant. It was cold enough that Frank's breath fogged the air, and he shuddered, shrugging deeper into his suede jacket. "This way." Fletcher inclined his head to where a pathologist in white jacket and steel-rimmed glasses sat perusing a folder of autopsy records. "I called down already. They're expecting us." The pathologist looked up, nodding as he got to his feet. "Kurt Massey," he said. Frank's gaze flicked over him. "Frank Black. We're here about the stripper." Massey took in Frank's weathered face, the unsettling intensity of his pale eyes. After a moment, he stared back down at the papers in his hand. "She went down fighting, I can tell you that." Frank tipped his head almost imperceptibly, as though listening to far-off music. The pathologist went on. "Blunt trauma and ante-mortem impact abrasions on her upper torso. She was a strong woman. Took some work to subdue her." From behind them came the whimper of rubber wheels against the polished floor, the creak of metal. Frank and Fletcher turned in unison to see an assistant pathologist pushing a stainless steel gurney through a set of double doors at the room's far end. Between the gurney's railings, a black body bag glistened. "But then the killer was no weakling either," the pathologist was saying. He beckoned the aide to bring the gurney alongside the table. As he did so, Frank felt a small jolt at the base of his skull, a familiar burst of heat that extended into his eyes, so that for a moment he was blinded. He blinked, swallowing as he quickly shook his head, trying to focus before the vision was gone. But it was too fast to capture. Instead, he found himself sucked into the gaze of the assistant pathologist, a moon-faced youngish man, maybe in his late 20s, with pockmarked spongy skin that looked as though it would dent if you pressed a finger against it. For just an instant his gaze held Frank's, a muddy gaze, eyes too easily stirred by fear or anxiety into a stealthy, blank reflection of whatever they saw. Then he turned away, handing a clipboard to Massey and waiting while he initialed it. Massey returned the clipboard. The aide left. "All right." The pathologist pulled the gurney closer to where Fletcher and Frank waited. When he reached to unzip the body bag, Frank stopped him, touching Massey's wrist lightly but commandingly as he looked into Fletcher's face. "Screams." Fletcher frowned. "Frank?" "Screams." A child's wailing voice, thin with terror, and another voice, torn between shrieks and gasping, a noise like canvas being shredded with a knife. Counterpoint to these, a dull, keening, mindless, deeper than the other sounds. A man. From the base of Frank's neck, heat radiates in a web of flame, racing beneath his skin to blaze beneath his eyes, which stare unblinkingly at a lamp thrown across a carpeted floor, magazines flying helter-skelter, the arm of a teddy bear poking from beneath a couch, an arm splayed limply across the carpet. He severed her head. Fletcher stared disbelievingly into Frank's distant eyes. Beside him, the pathologist waited a beat, then nodded. "No mean task, let me tell you," he said with a faint grimace. Frank licked his lips, tasting salt and copper. He fought nausea, the sense that he was being shoved into an airless room. What was the position of her body when they found her? Massey's reply was cool, uninflected, but his eyes showed a spark of something like fear. "She was on her back, with her arms crossed over her chest." Frank's gaze narrowed. His posture grew rigid, as though he were a hunting dog on point, and he stared with almost manic intensity at the body bag in front of him. About him, the room shimmers into another room, walls dappled with crimson, black and crimson shadows dancing against incandescent white. There is an instant of near silence, the screams still as though they are rain that stopped. At his feet, a sleeping woman lies on her back. Frank blinked. "Sleeping? No," he said. "You didn't find a murder weapon, but it was something he took from the crime scene." Fletcher watched him, fascinated and repelled, and nodded. "She was clothed," Frank went on, speaking as though in a dream. "There was no evidence of any sexual assault." The pathologist stared at Frank in amazement. After a moment he turned to Bletcher, confused. But Bletcher wouldn't meet his look. His gaze remained on Frank. Impelled to watch, though he wanted to tear away, he wanted to see anything but this man with the dark in his eyes. "What else?" demanded Bletcher. "She lies on the carpet, arms folded as in prayer, blonde hair a pool about her face. Her hands look gloved and red. There are red petals strewn across her cheeks and brow. The odor of scorched polyester fades into the stink of blood and excrement." Frank's voice twisted as though the words sought to burrow back inside him. "He cut off her fingers." Frank continued to stare fixedly, obsessively at the closed body bag. A muscle at the corner of his mouth twitched, a seam of ice giving way to floodwaters. "What did hair and fiber turn up?" he asked. Fletcher bared his teeth. His expression mirrored the pathologist's detached revulsion. "Maybe you should tell me." When Frank refused to rise to this, he said, "2 head hairs from a black male." Frank closed his eyes for an instant, opened them again. It seemed he might speak, and Fletcher waited expectantly. Instead, Frank spun on his heel and walked away. His soft tread echoed throughout the cavernous space. The steel fire door slammed behind him as he entered the stairwell and started back to the upper level. The pathologist watched him go, shaking his head. "How's he do that?" Fletcher stared after Frank's solitary figure, wincing slightly as the fire door banged shut. "I don't know," he said at last. "Lucky guesser." With no further farewell, he hurried across the room. Once in the stairwell, Fletcher took the steps 2 at a time, huffing a little at the exertion. "Frank," he called. "Frank!" At the top of the stairs, Frank waited, face set into a preternaturally calm mask. Fletcher came up beside him, panting. "Well, you obviously didn't come down just to say hi, Frank. What are you doing here?" Frank hesitated. Then, "I've seen this M.O. before," he said. A flicker of annoyance crossed Fletcher's face, but Frank's voice remained utterly composed and convinced. "I know the patterns and the profile." The lieutenant shifted his weight, barely keeping his impatience in check. "So what's the profile?" "He'll kill again." "Listen, Fletch. I'm working with a consulting group. These guys have a lot of experience with this sort of thing. They could have a look." The stocky man bridled. "My guys are good, Frank." "I know. I've got 3 detectives assigned to this," Fletcher continued heatedly, his voice rising. "What do I tell them?" Frank's gaze grew hard. "That the killer's going to be hard to catch, and that they could use some luck." He pushed open the door leading out. "Or some help." Frank went to the Ruby Tip, an alley where the sun never hit the pavement, where Frank could almost be grateful for the rank odors of rotting food and mildew. God only knew what you might smell otherwise. He'd never been there before, but he knew where he was. One of those places where everything got put on hold. Reality, trust, fidelity, even faith. "I'm only doing it for the money. I'm only doing it for a little while. I'm only doing it till the kids are out of the house. I'm only doing it because I have to." But nothing stops them from doing it, Frank thought somberly. Standing outside for several minutes in the sleety rain and watching as men passed each other silently on the club's front step. Nothing stops these girls from dancing, and nothing stops these guys from coming, not even a murder. He clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar pressure beginning behind his eyes, at the base of his neck. He tugged his jacket tight around his shoulders and went inside. Pulsing music filled the corridor. Frank winced, shoving past a man mopping the floor inside a private booth. Industrial green and rust-red doors lined the hallway, bad teeth waiting to be pulled from a diseased mouth. He slowed to look at the Polaroids taped to the private booths, overexposed images of women defined by big hair and big tits, names like syrupy drinks. Tiffany, Brandy. Amber Lee. When he reached the door that read Tuesday, he stopped. He gazed at the picture there, wondered fleetingly why the killer had chosen Calamity and not this girl. Both shared the same sweet, bland looks, the same suicide blonde hair, the same cantilevered cleavage in a cheap Victoria's Secret knockoff. His eyes narrowed, but there was not rush of warmth across his spine. No spate of infernal images that might provide an answer. He took a deep breath and went inside. It was a claustrophobic space, dimly lit by a single red bulb hanging overhead. Breathy, piped-in music made the cubicle seem even smaller, all oohs and moans and eerie, synthesized female voices. There was a metal folding chair, a large crumpled box of tissues on the floor beside it. The smell of pine disinfectant was so strong it made his eyes water. Frank moved the chair aside, standing in front of the window that filled the wall before him. The other side of the glass was covered by a tatty red velvet curtain. There was a slot in the wall beside the window. Frank withdrew his wallet, took out several bills, and creased them so they'd fit into the slot, then stuffed them inside. He waited. After a moment, a hand appeared inside the window and pulled the curtain aside, revealing the young woman in the Polaroid. Prettier than she'd looked in the photo, but more vulnerable and tired. Heavy foundation makeup, black mascara flecking her cheeks, lips chapped beneath pink gloss. She wore a red satin bikini bottom and matching push-up bra. As the curtain disappeared, her gaze met Frank's for an instant, flicked away as her mouth curled into a pouting smile. "Hi, you caught me." She arched her back so that her hair flowed down her shoulders, traced the outlines of her breasts with both hands. "I was just thinking of something nasty." Frank shook his head. "I just want to talk." Tuesday writhed in time to the music. "Talk to me," she murmured. "Tell me what you want." Frank reached inside his jacket and pulled out the newspaper photo of Calamity. Without a word, he held it up to the window. For a moment, Tuesday continued to sway and grind. Then she saw the picture. Abruptly, she stopped. She straightened and crossed her arms protectively across her breasts as she glared at Frank. "You knew her, didn't you?" he asked. "This isn't an interrogation booth. I'm not a cop." She licked her lips, no longer seductively, but nervously. "Well, I've already given my statement." Frank tried to catch her gaze. She seemed determined not to look him in the eye. "I might be able to figure out who killed her," he said. "Yeah?" This time her eyes did not lock with his. A faint pleading note crept into her challenging tone. "How?" Frank dipped his head slightly. "Did she have any fans? Any freaks?" Tuesday's eyes glittered. "If you didn't notice, the clientele here isn't exactly the picture of moral rectitude," she said dryly. "They'd applaud, but it takes both hands." Frank gave her a half smile. "Touché. Did you see anyone here the night she was murdered?" he asked gently. "Anyone who might have followed her home?" "I stopped looking at their faces a long time ago." He fought to keep the urgency from his voice. "Can you think of any reason someone might have killed her?" "A reason?" Tuesday stared at him in disbelief, then quickly looked away. "Men don't need reasons." Her voice trembled between rage and fear, and he saw her blink back tears. "All they need is an excuse." Pity welled in him. After a moment he nodded, pulled an extra bill from his wallet and stuffed it into the money slot. "I'm sorry. Thanks for your time." He was heading for the door when Tuesday's voice stopped him. "There's a guy." Her tone was resigned, but her eyes held a hint of reluctant gratitude. "He holds up poetry to the window." "What does it say?" She shook her head. "I don't know. It's in French. We call him the Frenchman." "Has he ever solicited anyone?" "No, but he paid her for a private." Frank nodded, trying to keep his voice even. "They have a camera in here?" She hesitated. Surveillance cameras were illegal, of course, but he knew plenty of places that had them. Before he could say anything else, Tuesday stepped backwards. She tilted her head back and her eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, indicating a spot above Frank's head. "Don't tell them I told you," she said in a low voice. He looked up to the far back corner of the private booth. A telltale laser red point of light glowed there. Bingo, thought Frank. He glanced at Tuesday, allowed himself a quick smile of thanks. She gazed back at him, her expression unreadable. A moment later, the heavy velvet curtain was drawn back across the window and he was alone once more. Night falls. But then, it is always night. For him, it is always dark. Rain slides across the windshield and there is a distant, rough murmur, as of waves or thunder. He drives across the bridge against the flow of traffic heading toward the city behind him. Ahead of him, an exit ramp leads down to a little used street that parallels the wilder precincts of Volunteer Park. He turns off, drives for several minutes with only the sound of the wipers and his own breathing as a wall between himself and the night. Even inside the car, he can smell the damp earth and the faintly saline reek of Seattle rain. There is a spot where the road curves, where for one last instant the night is simple darkness. That's when his heart begins to pound. Not fast, not at first. Slowly, but hard enough to feel as though someone is shoving a fist against his chest. He drives around the curve, and there before him is the stretch of road, the darkness soiled now by the first red eyes of taillights watching him. On the road's right shoulder, cars begin to appear through the mist. Some of the cars are empty. Many are not. You can see the silhouettes of men sitting and talking or embracing. The sickening, stigmatic flash of a head bobbing quickly up and down. His breathing grows louder. Within his chest, his heart aches as though he has been stabbed, as though they are heaving stones at him. He opens his mouth and gasps, the breath leaving him and freezing into a soundless howl. He parks, some distance from the other cars, though not so far as to draw any attention to himself. Soon enough there will be other cars beside his. For a few minutes, he sits there in the darkness. Then he gets out and heads into the woods. Susurrus of voices, dead leaves, distant traffic. The ground beneath his feet is spongy. Each step releases something from the earth, foul gases, an odor of decay. The trees move slowly in a breeze that reeks of ammonia and formaldehyde. Their branches trace words in the air, and his eyes water as without stopping. He reads them. His lips move, though he does not speak the words aloud. 'Tis now the very witching time of night, when churchyards yawn and hell itself breathes out, contagion to the world. They are there now. He can see them, walking. Between desiccated saplings at the base of the bridge, fog roiling about their legs, eyes like burned-out candles, black and edged with crimson, faces pocked with earth and the fragile tracery of decay, flesh peeling into bloody lace, minute creatures scuttling across their cheeks. Their mouths are sewn shut, the stitches dead black against bloodless skin. Some have their eyes sewn shut as well, threads drawn taut where they struggle to open them, their arms outstretched as they stagger sightless through the forest. Rhododendrons claw at them, leaves slashing at exposed tendons, the blackened knob of an arm from which the hand has been severed at the wrist. Despite their shuttered mouths, he can hear them, the quiescent sobs as they fall to their knees and couple there in the raw earth, eyeless, mouthless, thrusting like maggots burying themselves in the soil. Where they lie, small gouts of flame erupt from the ground and blaze about their bodies, but the corpses continue their coupling, heedless. He stops, bracing himself against a tree as he gasps and tries desperately not to see them or hear them. He turns and stumbles back to his car, crashing through bushes and sending stones flying beneath his feet. He is dimly aware of startled faces turning from him, and once a cautious hand reaching for his. He hears the low admonishment, "Hey, chill, man. It's okay. It's okay." And then a low whistle, someone pronouncing, "Looks like he saw a fucking ghost." He reaches the car, unlocks it, and slides inside, the door slamming behind him with a hollow rattle. His heart roars in his chest and his breathing comes fast and shallow. Nausea clutches at his insides. He's going to pass out. He leans forward until his forehead touches the steering wheel, sits there and takes deep breaths, forcing himself to exhale slowly to keep the wall from crumbling. After a few minutes, his breathing grows more even. His heart pounds, but he can count the space between each beat. It is getting better. Carefully, he brings his hands up to the wheel, thinking, I can do this. It is time to go. When suddenly there is a rap at the window. He jumps, drawing back so hard his knees bang against the lower edge of the wheel. The rap comes again, more insistent this time. Very slowly, he turns and gazes at the passenger window. A young man's face is framed there. Dark hair, close-cropped and flannel shirt casually unbuttoned inside a suede windbreaker pearled with moisture. The young man cocks his head and stares at him. After a moment, tentatively smiles. A reassuring smile. Hey, chill, man. It's okay. It's okay. The Frenchman stares back. From very far away, he hears a noise. The grating sound of the car's passenger door opening and then slamming shut, but he does not hear the door close. In the Frenchman's ears, the thunder is deafening. It is the sound of waves upon a shore, of the crimson tide rising until the city drowns beneath it. It is the sound of the world ending. Not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with the dull throb of a car engine revving up. The crunch of gravel beneath its wheels as its headlights slice through the shrouded mist and the dark sedan pulls away from the bridge. Later, when he stops and opens the door, the air smells sweet to him, purged of earth and sweat and rot. It smells like peace. It smells like the sea. He stands there for a moment, just breathing, thinking, I love this city, thinking how good it is to be able to save something you love. From far away drifts the murmur of traffic, the hoot of a car ferry drawing up to the main terminal just north of Pioneer Square. It is a sound he loves now. Once again, it is a world he can live in. He walks to the passenger side of the car and opens it. Something moves inside so that for an instant he freezes. A body, tumbling with exquisite slowness from the passenger seat out onto the ground at his feet. The Frenchman lets his breath out. He reaches down and grabs the body by the ankles and begins dragging it toward the back of the car. His hands are sheathed in latex now. Through them he can feel the spur of the young man's ankles. As he drags him, he looks impassively at the ruined face. Eyes and nose and lips indistinguishable now. A huge, ragged mouth, matted with hair and splintered bone. It is almost sunrise. He has work to do. It is a huge responsibility at the end of the world to save a dying city from damnation. Morning dawned, jewel bright, sunlight touching the beveled windows of Frank's bedroom and turning them into prisons. He lay on his side in bed, watching the rainbows dart across the floor, as outside the windows trees moved in a soft breeze. Behind him, Catherine lay with the comforter pulled up to her chin, eyes closed but smiling. She was pretending to be asleep. In front of him, Jordan sat cross-legged atop the comforter, frowning seriously as she looked at the classified section of yesterday's paper. From outside came the familiar whoosh of bicycles speeding past, the cheerful jingle of their old-fashioned bells momentarily drowning out birdsong, a neighbor whistling as she clipped her hedgerow. "What's a boxer?" Frank looked up, smiling into his daughter's puzzled face. "A big dog with a face like this," he whispered. Picking on a puppy was supposed to be a secret from Catherine, and he contorted his features into an admirable semblance of a very ugly canine. Jordan studied him, brow furrowed, and finally shook her head. "I don't think so," she said, and went back to the classifieds. Catherine's smile broadened. She shook her head. Did anyone ever really keep a secret from Mom? Ever? "What about a basset hound?" she suggested. Jordan stared guiltily at her father. Uh-oh. Busted by Mom. Still, she waited expectantly for him to weigh in on basset hounds. "Nope," he said, grinning as he leaned back to gaze at his wife. "Too many big ears in this house already." Catherine sat up and gave him her best Edward G. Robertson tough guy glare. "Now we know why Daddy has a face like a boxer." Jordan collapsed into giggles. The classifieds crinkled noisily as her mother reached over and grabbed her in a hug. "What are you two up to?" she began, when the morning's peace was broken by the telephone's shrill bleating. Frank answered it. "Hello?" "Frank." The voice on the other end sounded hollow and staticky. Someone on a portable. "It's Bob Bletcher. We found a body. I think you might want to come take a look." In one smooth motion, Frank swung around, sitting on the edge of the bed beside the nightstand. He could feel Catherine's eyes boring into him as he said, in a low voice, "Yeah, I think so." "Yeah, it's off 90, down by the Snoqualmie." Bletcher's words grew faint as the connection faded. "You'll see the circus." "Right. See you out there," said Frank. The line went dead, and he sat up as he replaced the phone. On the bed behind him, Catherine stared at him curiously. "Who was that?" Frank sat up for a moment before answering. "Bob Bletcher," he said at last. "He wants me to look at something for him." Catherine tried to keep the edge from her voice. "What?" "It's just a favor." He turned and gazed into her eyes, held them as he shook his head very slightly, indicating Jordan. Catherine bit her lip, nodding as Frank reached to tussle Jordan's hair. "We'll finish up later, okay, sweetie?" he said, and kissed her forehead. Jordan grinned. "Sure, Daddy." He crossed the room, stooping to gather up the rest of the scattered newspaper as he made his way to his dresser. With one hand he pulled the drawer open, started rummaging for socks and underwear. With the other hand he started to toss the paper onto a bureau when the front page caught his eye. Suspects sought in strip club slaying. There was another overexposed photograph of Calamity, and beneath that the words, "Forensic evidence points to a black male. Possibly." He gathered his clothes and shoved the paper under his arm. "I'll be home for dinner," he called over his shoulder as he hurried into the bathroom to get dressed. Soon he was heading east on Interstate 90, heading towards the Snoqualmie River. It was easy to find the murder site, about 20 miles out of town, where police cars and ambulances angled across the shoulder and onto the dead grass. Beyond was a broad, barren slope of land leading down to the river, thinly wooded with birches and young oaks, their gray limbs leafless, scratching fretfully at a heavy sky, the color of a gunpowder burn. Frank parked his Cherokee where the road ended and began walking toward the incline. Where the hill widened, unfolding into the river basin, several dozen uniformed officers and search and rescue personnel combed the frozen ground. There was the twittering of walkie-talkies and portable phones, the muted din of conversations and shouted commands, excited whines and barking from the Canine Corps straining at their leashes. Frank took it all in, but before he could start down the hill, a uniformed officer came panting up to him. "Sorry, sir, but this area is closed except to authorized—" "It's okay, officer." Bletcher's voice rang out over the clamor. "He's here at my request." The officer turned away as Bletcher joined Frank. "It looks like I called you out here a little hastily." Bletcher tilted his head, indicating that Frank should follow him downhill. "What is it?" "A body. Male." Bletcher emphasized the word, glancing sideways at Frank as he added, He was scarred so badly he couldn't tell the sex at first. Frank hesitated, staring down to where a knot of uniformed officers and detectives stood in a loose circle around a tarpaulin. Somebody set it on fire? Fletcher nodded and restlessly tapped his walkie-talkie against his side. Years of this sort of thing had taken the edge from his voice when discussing the daily horrors of his job, but he still couldn't keep the disgust from showing. Either before or after it had been decapitated. We can't tell yet. Frank looked at him, taking in the lines drawn tight around Fletcher's mouth, the smudged circles beneath his eyes. Then he brought his attention back to the group at the bottom of the hill. He recognized Giebelhaus and the other detectives from Fletcher's office. As their boss approached with Frank, they grew silent, eyes cold as they stared at the newcomer. Corpses and brutality were endured as part of the job. Interlopers were not. Frank edged past, not even noticing their icily detached expressions, the ironic cast of professional jealousy, warring with genuine curiosity. Frank ignored them. His gaze was fixed on the body beneath the tarp. "Has it been touched or moved?" he asked. Fletcher shook his head. The walkie-talkie crackled and he turned it down. "No." Frank swiveled his head, looking past the circle of dark-clad men. His gaze flickered restlessly from one barren corpse to the next, skirting a washed-out gully, stones heaped at the base of an immense fallen tree. At the very corners of his vision, phantom shapes pulse and retreat teasingly. "It looks like whoever killed him did it somewhere else, then brought him out here," Fletcher went on. "He must have parked on the road up top and pushed him down the hill." Frank nodded, hardly hearing him. A few feet away, Giebelhaus lifted his head and called out in a grudging tone, "You probably want to see the body." Frank's eyes narrowed, staring at a spot between ragged-looking saplings. "No, that's okay," he said, and without warning, he began to lope toward the trees. "Frank!" Fletcher called. Frank says nothing. He moves as though entranced, not feeling where branches whip against his hands and face, heedless of the icy damp seeping into his shoes. The softly pulsing shapes swim across his field of vision. In his mouth, there is the taste of blood and dirt. A fleck of something soft and damp as a bit of torn tissue. The sky overhead pales from pewter to silver. There is a pink glow on the eastern horizon. Dawn. But the glow grows too bright, too fast. Not dawn at all, but flames. Through the trees, a figure staggers, black and writhing like a mayfly caught in a candle's blaze, flame spurting from its flailing arms and head. Frank inhales sharply, almost gags on the stench of burning hair, roasting flesh. An inhuman voice is screaming, the crackling of the flames nearly drowning anguished shrieks, the glottal moans of someone trying to scream even though his tongue is seared to ash. All around him, the landscape melts into black and crimson, trees and brush bursting into flame. Shadowy forms drag themselves across the ground, eyeless, mouthless. The odor of burning sickens him. He wants to wrench his eyes away but cannot. The burning man is running at him, sparks and motes of ash spinning from him like fireflies. Within the inferno that was his face, Frank can see his eyes, twin rows of tiny red-streaked X's where they have been sewn shut. The melting horror that was a mouth, its stitches turned to flame. "Frank?" Fletcher's voice was a thread of light curling through that darkness. "Can you—" Frank says nothing, because now he sees another figure, one that stands half hidden behind two trees, its hands hanging limply at its sides. A man in jeans and a dark jacket, a baseball cap obscuring his face. "Frank?" It's the same killer. "What?" Frank blinked, focusing on Fletcher's confused expression. "He did it here." As he spoke, the vision faded. The reek of burning gave way to the chill scent of rain on stone. The horrific screams grew faint as the search helicopter roared directly overhead. Frank breathed in and out quickly as though testing the air, then looked down. The victim was set afire here in the woods. He began to walk, fast, kicking at leaves as he hurried down the slope, looking for traces of burning charred leaves or cloth, white ash. "How far to the river?" he called back to Fletcher. The chief detective strode after him. 1/4 of a mile. Frank's voice rang out clearly. That's where they came from. Fletcher paused, staring after him. Who's this guy think he is? Called out one of the detectives. Sherlock Holmes? I don't know, muttered Fletcher. I guess we'll find out. He raced down the hill after Frank. Behind him he heard his men grumbling, then calling out to each other as they prepared to follow. There was a burst of static from his walkie-talkie and then a staticky voice, the helicopter feed. This is Air Mobile 1 to base. Yeah, we've got what could be something down near the river. Right, Fletcher said grimly, setting off again. He found Frank near the river's edge. The thick carpet of leaves there had been disturbed. Foot-shaped impressions in the leaves, some solid prints in the black humus beneath. A little farther on, signs of a scuffle upturned stones. Broken mushrooms, more scattered leaves. Frank stood in the middle of it, scrutinizing the ground and surrounding brush. They were down here, he said. Fletcher came up beside him, panting slightly. Doing what, though? A frown creased the other man's gaunt face. I'm not sure. Fletcher shrugged, then why? Over here! The two men turned to see Giebelhaus and Detective Cam beckoning them urgently from behind a clump of birches. At their feet, 2 uniformed officers were digging furiously at the leaves. Frank sprinted toward them, Fletcher at his side. This is it, one of the officers announced, then swore. Frank and Fletcher drew up beside the other detectives, looked down to see what the officers had uncovered. A coffin, crudely made of unfinished wood. Splinters, feathering up where the nails had been hastily hammered in. On its top, a word had been scratched into the wood, the letters uneven and clumsily formed. P-E-S-T-E. Pest. Frank watched as the men cleared away the leaves, searching frantically for the edges of the lid. The smell of mold grew stronger and he shook his head. His throat ached, and his eyes, the warmth at the base of his skull was gone. He felt locked in ice. It's empty. His voice was numb. A moment later, one of the officers cried out as he found the edges of the buried rectangle. There was the shriek of nails and wood giving way as they pried the lid from the coffin and found nothing. A few dead leaves sifted to the bottom as the officers knelt and stared inside. Nothing at all, save a rust-colored stain in one corner. Look. One of the officers pointed at the interior lid and the other stared silently at what was there. A broken series of gouges in the rough wood, streaked with reddish-brown. The marks left where someone had tried to claw his way out. Shit, Fletcher swore beneath his breath. When he looked up again, he saw Frank walking away. Without a word to the others, Fletcher hurried to catch up with him. I think we should have a talk. Frank said nothing. They walked the rest of the way in silence until they reached Frank's Cherokee. Fletcher waited as the other man opened the driver door and stepped inside. He sat beside the wheel, staring wordlessly at the chief detective. Finally, as the helicopter's drone grew louder and more voices echoed up to them from the river, Frank nodded. Get in, he said. I'll take you back downtown. They drove without speaking, through the blasted winter countryside at the outskirts of town, and on into the heart of the city. When they reached downtown, it was raining again. Your associate was down in pathology looking at the body this morning, Fletcher said. A guy named Watts. Frank registered the name, shrugged noncommittally. I haven't spoken to him yet. A couple of my detectives did. He told them he was part of something called the Millennium Group. Frank still refused to meet his gaze. Yeah. But Fletcher refused to be put off. Is that who you're doing this consulting for? Uh-huh. The detective opened his hands, stared at his palms, then out at the driving rain. So, who are they? Frank's tone was measured, almost casual. Just some guys who used to work in law enforcement. FBI? Some of them. Fletcher studied him. My guys want to know why you're here, Frank. I still don't know what to tell them. Frank reached for the radio and pressed the volume button. The Kronos Quartet filled the Cherokee. They halted again at another light, and he turned to Bletcher. I'm here because I have a wife and a kid, and I want to raise them in a place they can feel safe. Abruptly, the Cherokee lurched forward, pulling over to the curb in front of the courts building. Bletcher sighed, lips pressed tightly together, and opened his door. He got out, but before he shut the door, he stuck his head back in again. How do you do it, Frank? Frank's cool eyes met his. Lucky guesser. Bletcher stared back at him, frowning. A moment later, the passenger door slammed, and Frank watched dispassionately as the detective sprinted through the rain to shelter. It was dark by the time Frank arrived home. He pulled the Cherokee into the driveway and, for several minutes, just sat there, staring up the small, neat sweep of lawn to the house. Sitting in the Cherokee, Frank smiled. In the mellow light from the street lamp, the little house fairly glowed. Moths fluttered around the porch light. One of the upstairs bedroom windows gleamed faint gold, its beveled panes like the spun sugar windows of a gingerbread house. May not be exactly 1 foot in Eden, he thought, but it's certainly a toe in the door. He got out, started up the walk. He was almost at the front steps when the sound of a car door slamming stopped him. Frank Black! He froze, his hands unconsciously curling into fists as he turned. On the far side of the road, a car was parked beneath the streetlight. A man stepped from it and strode confidently across the street and up the walk toward Frank. Yes? Frank waited. As he drew closer, the man's features became clear. Tall and muscular, about Frank's age, with a shaven head and a mustache. Wearing a Burberry raincoat and chinos, shoes that, like his coat, were expensive but nondescript. Everything about him, clothes, chiseled-featured, forthright gaze, exuded assurance and power. I'm Peter Watts. His voice was low and beautifully modulated, utterly self-possessed. From the group. I would have faxed you, but I wanted to introduce myself. Frank relaxed, allowing himself a cordial smile, and extended his hand. I'd heard you were down looking at the body. Did you find anything? Watts held out a manila envelope. A few things that slipped by, one salient oversight. Frank? The two men turned to see Catherine standing in the open front door of the house. The porch light made a dark aureole of her hair, and one hand closed the collar of her white bathrobe. Frank gave her a reassuring nod. I'll be right in, Catherine. She remained in the doorway for a moment as though waiting for an explanation. When none came, she tipped her head and shut the door. Watts waited until her shadow could be seen in the living room window and went on. There was severe blunt trauma to the body, so it was easy to miss. On the inside of the victim's left thigh, I found a needle puncture. Frank raised his eyebrows. From what? A syringe? Maybe. There was no evidence of anything administered in the adipose of surrounding tissue. He hesitated, then said, I know they think the killer is a black male, but... Frank nodded, staring intently at the other man's face. I've already ruled that out. Watts met his gaze, shot him a tight smile of agreement. Frank felt a small surge of pride. The severance of the head and fingers was done with skill and precision. Watts waited as Frank took the envelope from him, glancing at it. You know why. Frank tapped the envelope against his hand. The killer was covering his tracks. The victim may have scratched or bitten him. He may not have gone there to kill her. Watts agreed. The kitchen knife was convenient, that's all. But even with something that clumsy, he knew what he was doing, and he did it with real sang-froid, judging from his tidy cleanup. Frank nodded again with grim satisfaction. What does the group think? That your instincts are right? The killer is being compelled by an extraneous stressor. He's out of control. Anything else? Watts smiled. He looked like nothing so much as the revered head coach, welcoming a new star player to the team. That you're the right man for the job, and a fine addition to the group. All our resources are available to you. Frank inclined his head, acknowledging the unspoken congratulation in the other man's words. Watts raised a hand in farewell, turned, and headed back to his car. Frank watched him go, giving Watts a subdued wave as his car eased back out onto the main road. Then he went inside, stooping to pick up that morning's paper, still wrapped in plastic against the rain. The house was dark. Catherine was in bed beneath the comforter, facing away from him. Her curling hair spilled across the pillow in dark coils. For a moment, he stood in the doorway listening for Catherine's even breathing, wondering if she was already asleep. But no. "Who was that?" she asked. She did not turn to look at him. Frank took a breath, tucked a manila envelope under his arm. His name was Watts. He had some information for me. He sat out there for an hour. He could have come to the door. Frank made a helpless gesture. I don't think he wanted to impose. Catherine sat up in bed, the covers falling away from her. "I can handle imposition, Frank," she said. Her voice was strained, but not angry. This was not a new topic. "What I can't handle is secrecy." Her husband crossed the room and sat on the bed beside her. "I don't keep secrets, Catherine. I'll tell you anything you want. You know that. You think you're protecting me, but you make it worse, Frank." She shook her head, but there was still no anger in her tone. "You can't shut the world out from me. You can't ask me to pretend I don't know what you do." Frank reached over to place the envelope on the nightstand, then leaned back. He stroked Catherine's arm gently. "Everyone pretends. We all make believe. These men I catch, they make us." Catherine shook her head. "We're raising a daughter, Frank. The real world starts to seep in. You can't stop it." He pulled her to him, gently, and kissed her forehead. "I want you to make believe that I can." For a moment, Catherine gazed at him, her dark eyes thoughtful. Then she leaned into his embrace, let him hold her tightly as his mouth found hers, and for a little while, they really did make believe that the world wasn't there. Much later, he lay still abed, wide awake beside his wife. Catherine's breathing was slow and even. He kissed her cheek, tucking the comforter around her shoulders, and got up. He reached for the nightstand and the manila envelope he had left there. He went downstairs. Atop a lovingly restored mission oak desk sat Frank's computer, its screen glowing a neutral steel blue. Beside it was a digital scanner and a Mavograph video grab. Frank picked up his reading glasses where he'd left them beside the monitor, swept aside some stray papers, replaced them with the envelope Peter Watts had given him, and swung into his chair, grabbing his mouse and clicking on an icon. A small box appeared in the center of the screen, enclosing shimmering letters, "Connecting to Millennium Group." There was a series of beeps and the hissing squeal of the modem dialing and then connecting. Once he was sure it had made contact, Frank picked up the manila envelope and carefully opened it, spilling its contents onto the desk. Photos, an audio cassette, a videotape, faxes, and several pages of typed notes. Frank glanced at these, then turned back to the computer screen when it beeped. The screen was empty, save for the words, "Hello, Frank." He stood, taking the videotape Watts had given him, and put it in the VCR. Turned his chair so that he could watch the monitor, a pad of legal paper balanced on his lap, VCR remote in one hand and a pen in the other. There was a flicker of gray and white across the video screen. Grainy black and white images appeared. Frank frowned. The resolution was so bad it took him a moment to get his bearings. But here it was, the interior of the private booth at the Ruby Tip, viewed from above, at a wide angle from the surveillance camera. To the right of the screen was a dully gleaming slant of light that was the glass window. Behind it, a dark figure could just barely be glimpsed. Her seductive movements smelted down to a few stray background flickers. Most of the screen was taken up by a larger shadow close to the glass. The silhouette of a man in profile, his features all but obscured by a baseball cap. The audio blared a pounding hardcore song, But beneath its insistent beat, Frank could make out another sound, a man's voice, whispering, his tone urgent, though the words were garbled. Frank leaned forward until he was only inches from the screen, rewound the tape and played it back, listening even more intently than he had the first time, studying the oblique shadow of the man's face, the black slit that was his mouth as he whispered to the woman behind the glass. Frank's eyes remained fixed on the TV. His hand moved quickly across the notepad in his lap, transcribing words. Blood tide. He rewound it again and again, copying out more phrases, crossing them out and entering new ones. Blood rimmed tide. Blood dim tide. Where the air and money of innocence. Where the ceremony of innocence is drowned. He rubbed his eyes, squinting as he played back the tape for the dozenth time, and copied out the words more slowly this time, as they began to echo what he was hearing on the monitor. Where the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. He stopped the tape, stopped writing. The phrase tugged at his memory. He bit his lip, brow furrowed, then turned to the neat shelf of reference books and pulled down Bartlett's familiar quotations. He turned to the back of the thick volume, riffling through pages until he found what he was looking for. And there it was, Yeats, The Second Coming, half remembered from college English classes. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. He scanned through the rest of the verse until he reached its final lines. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? That's it, he whispered. The great plague in the maritime city, the enhanced voice cried hoarsely. You'll have your part in the lake, which burns with fire and brimstone. Frank closed the book, looked up at the bulletin board with its gruesome gallery of Polaroids. Crime scene photos, showing discrete parts of Calamity's battered body, the crook of leg, handless arms crossed upon a bloodied torso, hanks of hair. 3 photos lined up side by side by side. Close-ups of a pale, unidentifiable expanse of skin, the anonymous flesh bruised and scabbed with blood. Only in the 3rd picture was anything else indicated, by a circle drawn in red grease pencil. In its center, Frank could clearly discern a tiny black spot. On the inside of the victim's left thigh, he found a needle puncture. He turned excitedly from the Polaroid, back to the VCR, pointed the remote, and set their videotape rolling again. As he listened to the garbled transmission, he took a small stack of Polaroids from beside the keyboard and flipped through them yet again, half hoping that this time there would be something there he had not seen already, something beside blood and charred flesh. The great plague in the maritime city, a voice was intoning harshly from the TV. You'll have your part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. He reached the bottom of the little pile of Polaroids, several police photos of the crime scene he had visited that morning, churned up leaves, footprints, several sepia-tinged images of the buried coffin and its lid, the word etched there like like a warning. Pissed. Right, breathed Frank. He replaced the Polaroids, rewound the tape, and began to play it one last time. As the video leader ran, he swung around to face his computer and typed in a series of commands, then pressed the final key. The words, "sending video transmission," appeared next to the blinking cursor. He typed in another line, "sending GIF of crime scene photos," rose, and took the stack of Polaroids to his scanner. Its light flashed blindingly as it made digital copies of the photos. Frank watched it, brooding, as he waited for the transmissions to go through. When he reached the pictures of the coffin lid, sliding each beneath the scanner's flap, he frowned. Something there. There was something there. He reached for the newspaper he'd brought down with him and unfolded it, fighting off a rush of excitement as he read the front page. Police moved to clean up cruising in park. Beside the headline was a photo of the spot where last night's murder victim had last been reported seen by several anonymous eyewitnesses. The picture showed the wooded area at the base of the bridge. In the corner of the frame, the bridge's concrete abutment reared. Written across it in acid yellow spray paint was a single word: Pest. He knew of Volunteer Park, of course. It had been a notorious gay cruising spot since the early 1970s, but he had never been there at night. Certainly had never driven down this rutted spur of an access road, gravel and broken glass crunching beneath the Cherokee's tires. The woods were not empty, far from it. A line of cars snaked along the narrow road, and more cars were parked alongside, making the passage even more precarious. Frank eased the Cherokee between vehicles crawling almost at a standstill, their passengers staring out the window at him with measuring eyes. He finally found a spot to pull over. Zipping up his jacket, he slung his hands into his pockets and got out. Vapor from his breath flowed uneasily into the cold mist rising from the ground. From overhead echoed the steady drone of traffic on the bridge. He could hear voices nearby, men talking and calling to each other in hushed tones, the occasional burst of raucous laughter. Gingerly he stepped over a guardrail and headed into the woods, wandering for several minutes until he found a bicycle path, now heavily trafficked by men and boys. Solitary or in pairs, now and then a group of 3 or 4. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for: a broad, foot-worn trail that led up a steep embankment toward the bridge. He half walked, half ran up the slope, ignoring the curious and sometimes hostile looks he got from men accustomed to their own modes of conduct here. Finally, he stood at the top of the rise. He paused, catching his breath, then raised his head and saw what he had come to find: the acid yellow graffiti painted high above the heads of all those shadowy figures. Pest. He stood and stared up at it for several minutes, brooding. Pest meant plague in French, another stray bit of knowledge he recalled from school. Pestilence. And of course, who would notice it? Just another bit of scribbled nonsense, like Bat 47 or Samo or Bledsoe Rules. Anyone who did take note would make the obvious connection: more banal, homophobic bullshit from some religious zealot shouting "fag" with a French accent. Only it seemed as though this particular zealot had a deadly mission. Frank narrowed his eyes, gazing at the solitary word until it began to swim. He blinked and looked away, fighting sudden dizziness. All around him are corpses, walking stiffly through the drowned wasteland, stumbling toward him with arms outstretched and at the last instant shrinking back into the shadows where he does not move to embrace them. Behind their tortured figures, the trees writhe and scrape barren branches against the sky. Tendrils of smoke rise from them, and from the ground. Frank's shoulders tense. He grimaces as his nostrils fill with the odor of sewage and rotting flesh. His tongue tastes of cold cinders and something else, the thick, coppery tang of blood. He digs his hands deeper into his pockets, staring now with trance-like intensity into the darkness, and sees him. A lone figure, walking very slowly down the path. His shoulders hunched. He wore jeans, a dark, nondescript baseball jacket, dark baseball cap pulled tight onto his forehead. From beneath its brim, Frank glimpsed small, deep-set eyes, glancing around furtively, watching the couples as they made their way through the woods. The ragged whispers he heard moments before cohere into distinct words. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. And once again Frank saw the skeleton burning in the forest, its screams ripping through the trees as a figure lurked in the shadows, watching. A figure in jeans and dark jacket, a baseball cap hiding his features. The Frenchman. Frank stared at him, mouth parted. But before he could say anything, before he could move, the other man lifted his head and saw Frank standing there, watching him. And somehow recognized him, as Frank had recognized the killer. For an instant their eyes held, the thread between them drawn taut, which broke without warning when abruptly the Frenchman spun and fled. Frank lunged after him, past trees and through brush, branches slashing his face and his feet, stumbling on stones and broken bottles. His breath came in sharp bursts as he sprinted, leaving the path and following the other man uphill toward the bridge. Ahead of him came outraged cries as the Frenchman knocked someone aside, more shouts and curses as others scrambled to get out of his way. Frank panted, stooping as he dodged through dense foliage, not noticing where thorns tore at his sleeves and blood welled from his hand. The Frenchman seemed to know hidden trails here, zigzagging up the hillside and disappearing for a minute at a time, before Frank spotted him again, clambering up the slope. The Frenchman leaped across a small footbridge, knocking over a slightly built man and for a moment stumbling. Frank put on a burst of speed, but already the other man was up and running once more. Now he was beneath the bridge. Men watched him, stunned. From where they stood beside the abutment, others hastily retreated into the woods. Frank caught a glimpse of the Frenchman's back, crashing through an overgrown thicket just past the last massive concrete pier. Frank took off after him, shoving his way through the brush until he found himself at the bottom of yet another incline, this one leading up to the road. The Frenchman was nowhere in sight. Frank stopped, looked around frantically but seeing nothing. Seconds later, something dark pulsed at the corner of his vision. He looked up sharply to see the Frenchman on the bridge above him. With a gasp, Frank took off running again, pulling himself up the hill by grabbing onto bushes and broken saplings. Then he was at the top, climbing over the bridge railing until he stood on the sidewalk. Momentarily blinded by the glare of streetlights, headlights, deafened by the roar of nighttime traffic, he blinked, shading his eyes, and saw him running against traffic on the narrow walkway. Frank wheeled and raced after him. As he did so, the Frenchman looked back. At the sight of Frank, his face contorted, and without looking, he darted into the oncoming traffic. Horns blared, tires squealed as cars swung to avoid hitting him. Frank slowed his running, looking for a gap in the traffic, then jumped into the street in pursuit. In the far lane, the Frenchman raced between cars, and Frank followed him. In their wake, the bridge became a howling chaos of horns and shouts, cars swerving everywhere, the convulsive shock of metal hitting metal, broken glass sparking the air. A pickup truck spun out of control into the opposite lane, barreling toward Frank. With a cry, he threw himself onto the road, rolling, as the truck screeched to a halt inches from his face. Before the driver could register his shock, Frank was gone, stumbling to his feet and racing down the center lane. Here, he regained his full stride, chasing the Frenchman like a defensive back after a breakaway runner. But the Frenchman had found the center lane as well. He put distance on Frank, springing now toward the apex of the bridge. For an instant, Frank saw him, darting into the flow of traffic again. There were more horns blaring, more curses, and the Frenchman disappeared from sight. Cars skidded, slamming into each other in a chain reaction that reached all the way to where Frank ran, finding a path through the stopped vehicles. He sprinted onto the opposite sidewalk, stopped, and spun around, looking in vain for the Frenchman. He was gone. Frank stood there for a moment, hands clenching and unclenching, then drifted back into the herd of stalled cars. He searched through them intently, striving to find any sign of the fleeing man. Nothing. Then from farther down the bridge, a man threw his car door open and jumped out. "He jumped!" he shouted urgently. "I saw him!" Frank ran to the man. "Where?" The driver pointed at the bridge railing. "Over the side." Frank turned and ran to the edge of the bridge. He grabbed the rail with his hands and started over it, down into smoothly moving black water, its dark surface broken here and there by small whitecaps, stirred by the night wind. A long jump. Not suicidal, but dangerous enough to stop any sane man from leaping, unless he had a good reason. The Frenchman had a good reason. Frank shook his head, staring futilely at the river below. He saw no sign of any motion in the water save its normal flow downstream. No frantic swimmer, no body bobbing in the darkness. How could he have escaped? Frank stood there for several more minutes, scanning the restless water. At last he turned away, his face contorted with suppressed fury and frustration, and slowly began the long walk back across the bridge, through the angrily milling crowd of drivers and passengers and wrecked vehicles, past the first wailing police cars rushing to the scene. He kept walking until he reached the guardrail, and wearily swung himself over it, and began the long trek through the woods and back to his own car. And so, of course, he could not have seen the dark figure hanging by outstretched arms from one of the struts beneath the bridge, holding onto the metalwork beneath the walkway. A seam of blood spilling down one arm from a wound in his hand as the Frenchman twisted his head to watch in the distance another solitary figure, head bent, as it trudged down the embankment, away from the bridge. Frank woke the next morning, too soon, to the sound of rain against the windows. He groaned and sat up, glancing at his alarm clock. 7:30. The bed beside him was empty. Catherine had let him sleep in. For a few minutes he lay there in silence, listening to muted sounds from downstairs. Jordan scurrying back and forth, gathering school things. Catherine cleaning up the breakfast things and readying herself to go out. Finally he got up, showered, and dressed quickly. 2 hours later he was in Bob Fletcher's office. Fletcher stood at the back of the room, staring at the spare man poised in front of a blackboard covered with bizarre phrases, snippets of poetry, random words pulled from the videotape Frank Black had brought him. Around the lieutenant stood more than a dozen of his detective force and associated personnel. He'd called them in for this briefing after Frank rang him in the middle of the night, telling him about the man he'd pursued across the bridge and exhorting the detective to allow Frank to make a presentation based on what he'd discovered. Fletcher had agreed, reluctantly. That morning, he'd rounded up his staff, short-circuiting more than one coffee break and interrupting several detectives who'd already been working round the clock on this case. Now Fletcher's reluctance grew even more deep, not so much because he doubted Frank. He'd seen Frank perform some of the feats of investigative legerdemain that had made him a legend, but because he didn't. Fletcher wanted to believe Frank Black, and on some, perhaps unconscious level, the detective knew that he did believe him. There was something about Frank, the way that your attention focused on him, even while not totally buying what he was saying, the way his gaunt face caught the light and held it. Even in a room full of people, you could always notice him first. Quiet, loose-limbed man with the haunted eyes, standing off to the side and watching. It was almost as though he had a greater density of being than other people, as though, compared to him, the rest of them were merely shadows. A snort of disgust brought Fletcher's attention back to earth. He glanced aside, saw two of his detectives staring disdainfully at the front of the room. Bletcher looked back to see Frank pointing his remote at the VCR Bletcher had set up, alongside a TV monitor and blackboard and small table scattered with Frank's notes. "This is him," Frank was saying, his voice low but still commanding. He leaned over to adjust the contrast on the TV. The screen showed an enlarged, extremely grainy image, a digital array of gray and black pixels that formed a sort of impressionistic vision of a man's face. A dull, piggish-looking face, coarse-featured, his skin, even in this imperfect transmission, clearly showing gouges left by acne scars. His thin lips moved slowly, forming words. But then Frank paused the image. He had not yet switched on the audio. He glanced out at his audience, bellicose detectives with crossed arms and dubious expressions. A few faces more openly interested, but they were all listening. Fletcher watched as Frank took a deep breath and felt a stab of sympathy for him. "Okay, Frank," he thought. "Here's your chance. Do your damnedest." "The dancers called him the Frenchman," Frank began, indicating the frozen image on the monitor, because he held poems to the window, poems written in French. "I was able to have the picture and audio enhanced off the original." He moved away from the monitor, at the same time taking aim with the remote. The frozen video image jumped back to life. The Frenchman's voice filled the room. It, too, had been enhanced. A hollow, robotic tone that barely sounded human at all. But the words were clear. "I want to see you dance on the blood-dimmed tide." As he spoke, Frank copied his words onto the chalkboard. "I want to see you dance on the blood-dimmed tide, where the ceremony of innocence is drowned." He put down his chalk, picked up the remote, and once more paused the tape. When he looked up, 15 bemused faces stared back at him. Fletcher folded his arms. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice authoritative but not hostile. Frank nodded, acknowledging him. "It's from a poem called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats." One or two people made appreciative sounds, recognizing the title. Frank went on and recited, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned." He paused, just long enough for everyone to register his words, and said, "He's writing about the apocalypse." Then he started the tape again, turning back to the chalkboard and transcribing the Frenchman's twisted litany. "This is the second death, the abominable and the fornicators. This is the second death. You'll have your part in the lake." Bletch shifted, surreptitiously looking around to see how the others were taking this. Their faces were rapt, if skeptical. At least he got their attention, thought Bletcher. In his seat, Giebelhaus fidgeted, frowning. "The second death," he demanded. "What the hell is that?" Next to him, Detective Cam cocked his head. "It's from the Bible," he said. His tone and expression told Bletcher that Cam, at least, didn't think this was so crazy. "The great plague in the maritime city," the Frenchman intoned in his infernal whisper. "You'll have your part in the lake, which burns with fire and brimstone." Frank stepped in front of the screen as the tape began to loop once more. "That line is from Revelation. Death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. The abominable and the fornicators. This is the second death." Fletcher nodded almost imperceptibly. In the room around him, all eyes were on Frank Black. "So, what's he trying to say?" broke in Giebelhaus belligerently. "He's preaching," offered Bletcher. "He's prophesying," countered Frank. Giebelhaus lifted his chin, his tone combative. "The end of the world?" Frank pointed to the last two lines on the blackboard. "The great plague in the maritime city." He paused to let this sink in. then translated, La Grande Peste de la Cité Maritime. Peste was the word written on the lid of the buried coffin. The detectives stared at him, uncomprehending. Some of them shook their heads, a few muttered in outright disbelief. It's from Nostradamus, Frank explained, the 16th century apocalyptic poet. He wrote hundreds of quatrains, 4-line poems which foretell the end of all things. Giebelhaus nodded, his expression mock conviction. Like rap music. A few people laughed nervously, but most continued to stare at Frank with tense, barely restrained hostility. Fletcher uncrossed his arms and put on his best good cop expression. So you think the killer's fulfilling the prophecy? He asked, feeding Frank lines. Frank gave the detective a quick look that might have been gratitude, then nodded. The great plague in the maritime city will not stop until death is avenged, he recited. By the blood of a just man, taken and condemned for no crime. The great lady is outraged by the pretense. He stopped, gazing out at the rest, waiting to see if any of them would respond, to see if anyone got it. No one did. Seattle, he went on, trying to keep his voice even. The maritime city. AIDS, the great plague. Death avenged by a just man, taken and condemned for no crime. In his seat, Cam nodded excitedly. The killer thinks he's righteous, a just man. Frank's eyes glittered. Yes. Fletcher tipped his head back, switching from good cop to devil's advocate. So who's the great lady, and why is she outraged? Frank gave him the slightest hint of a smile. Touché. The killer is in conflict about his sexuality, and he feels guilt, quite possibly from his mother. She is the great lady. So, in an effort to feel normal, he goes to peep shows to try to feel something toward women. Desire, love, anything. But all he feels is anger. Anger that fuels a psychosis which distorts and twists his view of reality. Giebelhaus snorted. Twist it to fit some screwy French poetry? Frank stared at him impassively. The killer doesn't see the world like everyone else. A long moment of silence. Then Fletcher's voice rang out, his tone challenging. So how does he see it? For an instant, the detective's eyes locked with Frank's, defying him to tell the truth, to reveal what it was Frank Black saw. At the front of the room, Frank met the other man's gaze. When he replied, it was with a single word. Differently, he said, and turned back to the VCR. Wait a second, Giebelhaus contested hotly. You say this guy is angry at women, that he cruises boys, but then he killed this John Doe we found burned in the forest. Now how does that work? What the hell kind of M.O. is that? He's very confused, said Frank. Giebelhaus grunted. Undoubtedly. His way of dealing with it is by fulfilling a prophecy, avenging the great plague that confuses his own dark desires and justifies his mother's outrage. It's also why he rearranged the position of the female victim, to have her arms crossed upon her chest, out of some twisted respect for her. Giebelhaus shook his head stubbornly. I don't buy it. Beside him, Cam nodded, but reluctantly. It's a good story, he said, but I agree the evidence just doesn't support it. The hairs we pulled off the female victim were from a black male, Frank, chimed in Fletcher. For the first time, Frank's voice rose. There has been only one incident of a black male serial killer. Statistically, it's improbable. So we just throw out the evidence? Giebelhaus began angrily, but Frank cut him off. Those hairs could have been planted or picked up before the murder. They could have been left in the body bag. I've seen that before. Giebelhaus shot him an impatient glance, then turned to Fletcher. Look, Bob, we're not the FBI. We've got limited resources. We go chasing the wrong guy, we could end up with more victims. I don't think we have time to waste. Do you? Fletcher stood there, silent. taking it all in. Looks of consternation and annoyance and just plain boredom on the faces of his staff. The grainy, nightmarish video image intoning its dreadful liturgy of blood and redemption. In front of them all, the embattled figure of Frank Black, his expression open but uncompromising. The VCR remote in his hand like a blade. The detective waited, not wanting to admit that his heart was clenching inside him, not wanting to admit that he was waiting for Frank to come to his own defense, to offer something besides the doomsday ramblings of a madman as an explanation for a murder. But Frank said nothing, only stood there, preternaturally calm as he surveyed the expectant faces of the detectives turning from Giebelhaus to himself to Bletcher, then gazed into Bletcher's eyes as well. The chief detective waited another moment. Then, "No," he said. The word held all the weight of his 18-odd years on the force. "No. I'm sorry, Frank." A strained silence filled the room. A line had been drawn. Bletcher and Giebelhaus and the others were on one side, and Interloper on the other. Without a word, Frank turned and hit the eject button on the VCR, took the videotape, and handed it to Bletcher. "I've got to get home to my family," he said, and left. He found the Cherokee in the parking garage beneath social services, slid inside, and pulled the door shut after him. There, alone in the artificial half-light beneath several thousand tons of steel and concrete, he allowed himself a moment to let go. Just an instant. A second of clarity when he was neither Catherine's husband, nor Jordan's father, nor a bright white template upon which evil could write its name. Over and over and over again until he collapsed. A moment in which he was nothing but Frank Black. A small spark of consciousness with neither conscience nor knowledge to tether him to this city, this world. And the moment was all it lasted because the world was there, pressing its face against the window, demanding his attention. Catherine was right. It wouldn't go away, and no amount of pretending would ever change that. At the thought of Catherine, the nausea and defeat lodged in his chest began to melt away. And then Catherine brought images of Jordan, her eyes squinched shut as she shrieked with delight, her face snuggling up between her parents in a bed on Sunday morning. And for a moment, seeing them both there, the two people who were more precious to him than anything on earth, for that moment, Frank was content not to pretend at all. A car whooshed past, the sound magnified by the cavernous space of the parking garage. Frank started blinking as he cleared his head of everything that had crowded it. Jordan, Catherine, Bletcher, the Frenchman. He reached for the ignition and started the car and began to pull out of the lot. He was halfway down the exit ramp, squinting into the unaccustomed brightness of gray daylight filling the arch that led outside, when suddenly a hulking figure darted in front of the Cherokee. Frank slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing as the car heaved to a stop. The figure pounded on the front hood angrily, then moved toward the driver's door. Frank's mouth tightened when he saw that it was Bletcher. Frank rolled down the window. "Tell me why I'm wrong," Bletcher cried. His hands tightened on the edge of Frank's window. "Why should I listen to you?" Frank shook his head, trying to keep his voice even, trying not to sound judgmental. "You're in a hard position, Bob. You've got people to answer to, a department to run. Tell me how you know, how you're so sure." Bletcher's urgent tone grew almost beseeching. "How do you do it, Frank?" Frank said nothing. After a moment, Bletcher raised his head. "You see it, or something," he prodded. Frank sighed. "It's complicated, Bletch. You see it, don't you?" Frank said nothing. Rain slanted through the garage opening, rattling across the windshield. At last he said, "I see what the killer sees." "What?" Bletcher dipped his head so it poked through the driver's window. "Like a psychic?" "No." Frank spoke slowly, deliberately, as though he were explaining some intricate mechanism to his daughter. "I put myself in his head. I become the thing we fear most." How? I become capability. I become horror. Frank's words dropped like stones heaved from a cliff. What we know, we become in our heart of darkness. It's my gift. It's my curse. And it's why I retired. He finished, looking up for the first time into Bletcher's intense, almost frightened eyes. Then what the hell are you doing here, Frank? The detective whispered. Get out. Leave it alone. Frank's expression sloped into exhaustion. I tried. What brought you back? Demanded Bletcher. But Frank only shook his head. Some other time, Bletch, he said softly, rolling up the window. And as the detective stared somberly after him, he pulled away and drove off into the rain. Catherine's car wasn't in the driveway when he got home. Frank glanced at his watch. After 3. Jordan would already be back from school. He parked and sprinted through the rain onto the porch and stopped. The front door was open. No sounds came from inside. No after-school chatter from Jordan, answering Catherine's gentle questions. No radio, no cheerful theme music from Wishbone or any other of his daughter's favorite shows. He pushed the door gently and stepped into the front hall. Catherine? No answer. The boxes Catherine was going to take to the recycling center had not been moved. The newspaper was where he'd left it that morning, unread, still bound in plastic. Catherine, he called again, heading for the kitchen. Jordan? The kitchen was empty. There was no note on the counter. The LCD readout on the answering machine read 0. In the middle of the floor, a magazine lay where it had fallen, spine up. Catherine! Frank shouted and raced to the second floor. In Jordan's room, the bed had been made, with its new pink spread and new stuffed bulldog keeping guard by his daughter's pillow. He turned away and started for the other bedroom, pausing to glance in the bathroom. The wastebasket had been overturned, spilling tissues across the floor. On the side of the white porcelain tub, the crimson imprint of a child's hand glowed like a warning beacon. Jordan, breathed Frank. He fled the room, his footsteps echoing through the house as he ran downstairs and back outside. He was halfway across the lawn, heart pounding as the rain lashed his face, when he heard a door slam. Frank! Wait, Frank! Shielding his eyes against the rain, Frank turned to see his neighbor, Jack Meredith, running from his house. Frank! Have you seen Catherine and my daughter? Frank shouted. Meredith nodded excitedly, his round face red with exertion. He was panting, half in and half out of his raincoat, and tugged ineffectually at the hood as he spoke. I was just coming to leave you a note, he said breathlessly. She couldn't reach you and I... Where are they? They went to the hospital. What happened? Meredith shook his head, trying to catch his breath. Your little girl, she had some kind of seizure. His words died away. Jack Meredith stood alone in the rain, watching as Frank leaped back into his car. Moments later, the Cherokee peeled out of the driveway. The older man raised his hand in mute farewell, then turned and trudged back to his own home. Over the years, Frank had spent too many hours in hospitals. The only time he cared to recall was the night of Jordan's birth, nearly 7 years ago. As he hurried through the emergency room entrance, that day came back to him. The same faintly reassuring smells of disinfectant and air conditioning, the same crisp undercurrent of PA announcements, beepers, telephones, murmuring voices. Only now it all seemed utterly sinister. The doctors standing in the hallway, conferring in hushed tones. The cabal of ER nurses behind their station. Green-clad technicians hurrying in and out of elevators. Frank stood helplessly in the middle of the corridor, looking for someone to ask for directions. That was when he saw 2 orderlies shoving a gurney down the hall. A small form lay on it, sheet pulled up to its chin. An O2 mask covered the child's face, so he couldn't discern if it was Jordan or not. Trailing the gurney was a doctor, rapidly scanning a clipboard. There were traces of blood on the medic's gowns and the sheet covering the child's body. Jordan, whispered Frank. He started blindly after the gurney, nearly bumping into a nurse. Immediately he accosted her. "My daughter was brought in here, Jordan Black." The nurse frowned. Jordan Black. She glanced down at a sheaf of papers in her hand, but before she could say anything, Frank heard another voice. "Frank? Catherine." He hurried to where she stood, exhausted, alongside the elevator entrance, and desperately grabbed her arms. "What happened to her?" Catherine shook her head, fighting tears. Her voice was thick. "I was in the kitchen when I heard this thump upstairs. I found her on the floor in the bathroom. She'd passed out and hit her head on the sink. They're running tests." "Where is she?" Catherine gestured limply at the elevator. "In pediatric ICU. She's sleeping now. They sedated her. She's got a very high fever." When the elevator doors opened, he followed her inside, elbowing in among nurses and medics, a woman holding a heart-shaped helium balloon and a teddy bear. They got out at pediatrics, and he walked numbly alongside his wife. The cheerful yellow walls with their colorful posters and children's drawings seemed monstrous to him, mocking the pale figures he glimpsed inside the rooms they passed. A girl as thin as a wraith, her bald head gleaming beneath the glow of a TV tuned into Barney. A man sitting with head bowed alongside a narrow hospital bed. Two small children squabbling with their older brother, tugging at his hospital pajamas. "Here," Catherine stopped outside a room, its door ajar. "In here." He entered, Catherine behind him. It took him several moments to find his daughter, surrounded as she was by blinking monitors, the transparent coils of an IV, the unyielding bars of a hospital bed. But there she was, a tiny figure beneath yellow sheets and a machine-made quilt with tulips on it. Frank blinked and dashed a hand across his face, then walked to the bed. Jordan's face was chalk white, her curling hair matted to her head. On her brow, a Care Bear's bandage covered a nasty-looking bump. The IV snaked into her arm. Her small hand protruded from beneath the quilt, palm open. Frank bent over and rested his own palm upon her forehead. "They're pretty sure it's just a very bad flu reaction," Catherine said softly. "The doctor says it's not uncommon for children with very high fevers to have these seizures with them." Frank shook his head, his throat tight. "When will we know?" "They're calling in a specialist." "Why isn't he here yet?" Catherine sighed. "She's on her way." Frank lowered his head to brush his lips across his daughter's cheek. "So fragile," he breathed. He stayed like that for several minutes, watching the slow rise and fall of Jordan's chest beneath the blankets, listening to the steady percolating of the IV. At last he looked over to Catherine. "You should try to rest," he said. He inclined his head at a cot alongside one wall, neatly made with clinical white sheets and pillow. "I'll stay here." "We'll both stay here," Catherine replied. And she pulled a chair alongside him to continue her vigil. It was late when he woke, sprawled in the chair where he had finally fallen asleep. Someone had dimmed the lights in the room, and even from where he sat he could hear how hushed the pediatric unit had become. Catherine lay passed out atop the cot. She hadn't even bothered to get under the covers. In her hospital bed, Jordan lay just as she had earlier, her position unchanged, save that her mouth was very slightly parted and her hand had curled into a fist. Frank remained motionless in his chair and watched her for a long time. He must have dozed off again. A sound woke him, and he opened his eyes to see the night nurse entering the room, her tread soft but brisk. She carried a pannier of medical supplies. Frank watched her, unmoving, as she stepped to Jordan's bed and set down the pannier, removed the apparatus for drawing blood. Taking Jordan's limp arm, she swabbed it, then withdrew a needle connected to the slender tubing that led to a hemovial. In her bed, Jordan stirred, and the nurse murmured to her gently. A few seconds later, the transparent tubing darkened to crimson, as blood filled it and the waiting vial. The nurse glanced over her shoulder at him, then back at Jordan. He continued to stare wide-eyed at the needle in her hand. "Frank?" Catherine's low voice came to him from across the room. She blinked sleepily, shot a quick, concerned look at Jordan to make sure the girl was okay. Then she gazed curiously at her husband again. "What is it, Frank?" His eyes narrowed. His expression grew more intent, almost hungry. "He's taking blood." Warmth stabbed behind his eyes. He felt a searing heat surge up his spine. Catherine shook her head, confused. "Who?" "The killer." He got to his feet, meeting her stare and nodding. "He's got more bodies. He's buried them alive." Catherine hesitated, looking quickly at their daughter on the hospital bed, then back at her husband. "Go, Frank," she said. Her voice was urgent. Silently, he grabbed his coat and rushed from the room. Fletcher and his men were already in the forest when Frank arrived. He saw the line of police and undercover cars parked alongside the desolate stretch of road and heard the distant baying of bloodhounds. He sprinted through the undergrowth, not slowing until the first pinpricks of light began to show through the thicket of trees, dozens of flashlights bobbing through the darkness. The wind blew cold up from the river, and with it the smell of stone and snowmelt. Overhead the moon broke through the clouds, its uneasy glow touching branches and mounded leaves with silver before it disappeared once more behind the clouds. As Frank drew nearer to the search party, the metallic chatter of radios and walkie-talkies destroyed the last illusion of silent woodland. He found Fletcher, trailing the rest of the group. Like the others, he was heavily bundled up against the cold, his breath misting the air. He raised his head in greeting when he saw Frank, then lifted the hand holding his walkie-talkie as it blatted loudly. "We've covered the area a mile north down to the river. Nothing." Fletcher frowned. "Copy." He slowed his steps to let Frank catch up with him, shuffling through frost-rimmed leaves. "I'm going to call this off, Frank. Local search and rescue has been here for nearly an hour, and my men have been out for almost that long. This is getting us nowhere. We'll come back in the light of day." He stopped, waiting for Frank's reaction, but Frank kept on walking. His head swung back and forth, his hands trailed along the trunks of trees and traced the edges of boulders. "They could be dead by then," he said simply, and forged ahead. As Fletcher stared after him, Giebelhaus and Cam drew up alongside of the chief detective. Giebelhaus gaped at Frank in open disbelief. "Jesus Christ, what's he think?" he sputtered, teeth chattering. "They're cryogenically preserved? What is he doing?" wondered Cam. Fletcher shook his head in dismay. "I have no idea." He began to run, following where Frank had turned down a deer trail leading to the river. "But I'm going to find out." The recent heavy rains had caused the river to flood its banks. Black water extended to the very fringe of the woods, moving swiftly beneath the restless moon. The searchers had stopped here. Their flashlights formed an eerie barrier at river's edge as they wandered back and forth, pointing their beams at the far shore. The dogs whined and pulled at their leashes, sniffing eagerly at the water. Fletcher blinked, shading his eyes as the searchers turned their bright halos on him. "This is it, Bob," somebody yelled. "We turn back here?" Fletcher strode toward them, trying to pick out Frank among the milling figures. Sudden splashing stopped him in his tracks. He craned his neck, turned until he saw Frank Black's lanky form wading into the rushing water. "Frank! What the hell are you doing? You'll freeze to death!" But Frank never paused, just kept on picking his way carefully through the torrent. Fletcher swore angrily, watching as the water rose higher and higher until it reached Frank's hips. Damn it, Frank! Fletcher shoved his way through the crowd, watching the lone figure in amazement. When he reached the water, he stopped. For another minute, he watched his friend's spare silhouette wading through the current. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped into the river. Jesus! The cold bit into him, so intense that for an instant he couldn't move. Before he could think better of it, he began to wade across the river. Behind him, the other detectives and rescue squad held back, exclaiming loudly, "You nuts, Bletch! Let him go! For Christ's sakes, Bob!" Fletcher ignored them. He forged on, gasping as the water lapped about his ankles, then his calves and thighs, and finally reached his crotch. "Good thing I already have a family," he wheezed as he finally made it to the shore. Ahead of him, Frank's flashlight shone through the trees, darting from one copse to another. "Frank, wait up!" Fletcher shouted, staggering from the water and training his own light on the woods in front of him. He started to run, as much to get the blood flowing in his legs again as for any other reason, nearly stumbling on the slickly frozen ground. When he reached the trees, the footing was better, scattered stones and dead leaves that crunched beneath his feet. He tried to keep Frank in sight, the other man's flashlight bobbing through the shadows like a will-o'-the-wisp. "Frank!" he yelled again, when suddenly his foot struck something hard. There was a dull, hollow thunk. Fletcher stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the ground. He raised his foot and brought his heel down hard against the forest floor. Thunk. There was something hollow beneath him. "Frank!" he shouted. "Frank!" his voice rising almost to a scream as he dropped to his knees. "Frank, over here! I found something!" Frantically, he scooped away the leaves. Behind him, Frank ran up breathlessly and knelt beside him, the two of them sweeping their hands back and forth as leaves flew up all around them. Within moments, the space was cleared. Fletcher gazed down at it, stunned. Oh, Christ. Where the leaves had been was the wooden lid of another coffin. Several small holes had been bored into its surface. Air holes. Crooked letters were scratched into the rough grain. La Grande Dame. Frank and Fletcher worked furiously. "Find the edges," Frank yelled. "There!" He pointed to where one corner of the coffin protruded from the earth. Fletcher grabbed it and began to try to yank it loose. As he did so, muffled pounding sounded from beneath the lid, and frenzied, inhuman cries. Fletcher drew up in horror. "Oh my God. Find the screws. The other one was screwed shut," Frank shouted. He pulled a Swiss Army knife from his pocket and jammed it down where Fletcher pointed, spearing the center of a metal screw. As he spun it out, the muffled shrieks grew louder and even more frantic. The coffin's lid shuddered as whatever was beneath struggled to free itself. "Here!" Fletcher cried, grabbing the Swiss Army knife from Frank and loosening another screw. His hands shook so badly the knife fell. Frank snatched it back and finished the job. Now one edge was free. The shrieks became a sustained howl of pure terror. Frank and Fletcher strained with the coffin lid, trying to find enough leverage to pull it loose. The wood began to splinter, at last gave way as they fell backwards, grappling for their flashlights. As they did so, a figure lurched from the coffin. The stench of excrement and decaying flesh was so strong Fletcher gagged, then recoiled as he gazed in horror at what was toppling onto the ground beside him. A young man, so filthy it was impossible to discern what color his skin had been, or even if any flesh remained upon his body. He flailed helplessly into the fallen leaves, still screaming, though now Fletcher could see why the sound had been muffled. The boy's mouth had been sewn shut, and his eyes. Even his hands had been sewn together, rough stitches binding them at the wrists, the skin frayed and thin as bloodied linen. His eyelids were bleeding. He had somehow managed to get them half open. His face held the starkest, most primal horror Bletcher had ever seen. "My God," the detective whispered. The boy thrashed and Bletcher recoiled. Then, as though awakening from a nightmare, he began to shout hoarsely at the top of his lungs. "Paramedics! Paramedics! We need some paramedics over here!" From across the river came answering cries, loud splashing as the rescue team began to ford the river. The boy's cries gave way to a sort of ululating sob. Frank took him gently in his arms and began to lift him, pausing so that Bletcher could get to his feet and help. Together they carried the quaking, delirious figure away from his tomb. His skin was damp and icy to the touch. Frank stared at the bloody figure. Dirt and filth caked to his clothes, then put his arms around him and held him close, trying to warm him with his own body. The boy struggled in his embrace, shuddering with cold and terror. Frank thought of holding Jordan when she'd had the chicken pox, her small body alternately chilled and burning with fever, trembling in the night. He tightened his grip on the young man's shoulders and murmured wordlessly, comfortingly, trying, just for an instant, to impart some sense that the world was shifting back to normal, that all would be well, that the nightmare was over. But Frank knew, in fact, that it was not. He knew the truth of it was that, for some people, the nightmare never, ever ends. He craned his neck, looking to where the first searchlights were coming into view, moving rapidly through the darkness as the paramedics raced toward them. A few feet away, Bletcher crouched once more at the edge of the makeshift casket, looking down into it with one hand and covering his nose and mouth against the smell. Suddenly he gave a harsh gasp and very gingerly reached inside. There was something in the far corner, a plastic bag. With shaking fingers, Bletcher grasped it and pulled it out. It was heavy, the plastic slick with some viscous substance. As he held it up, he swung his flashlight around so that the beam played across it. Within its cloudy plastic sheath, a face stared out at him, its eyes already occluded with decay, matted blonde hair shrouding its livid cheeks. Gray flesh clung to the knobs of vertebrae that bulged from the base of its neck. One ear had almost been severed. It dangled like a swollen fruit beside her jaw. Across her forehead, a word had been carved, like a brand. Mystery. Calamity. Fletcher whispered. Tears of horror and disgust filled his eyes. He got to his feet, trembling, and turned to Frank. As he did so, the first paramedics came running into the clearing and drew up, shocked to see the chief detective standing there with this macabre trophy. "They're here to help you," Frank murmured to the young man, still struggling and moaning in his grasp. Gently he handed the boy to the paramedics, then straightened and addressed the remaining men. "There may be others," he said, indicating the surrounding forest. Murmurs of assent went through Bletcher's army, a bark from one of the anxious bloodhounds. Then the search crew fanned out and began to hunt in earnest. It was nearly dawn when Frank and Bletcher returned to headquarters. Grimy light filtered through the windows of Bletcher's office. People darted in and out, dropping off papers, delivering faxes, and manila file folders. Frank sat in a swivel chair, his eyes closed, face drawn. Behind his desk, Bletcher swung restlessly back and forth in his swivel chair, phone cupped to his ear. A shadow filled the doorway, Someone crossed quietly to where Frank sat and tapped him on the shoulder. His eyes flew open and he stared up into Giebelhaus's chastened face. "Here, I thought you could use this," he said, handing Frank a mug of coffee. Frank took it. "Thanks." Giebelhaus nodded a token apology and leaned against the table. They found 2 more coffins. Both were empty. Frank eyed him coolly. They wouldn't have been for long. Behind them, Bletcher hung up the phone and quickly turned to the other 2 men. He just gave a description of the suspect. White male, late 20s, wearing a ball cap. They're working up an artist's profile now. He paused, staring purposefully at Giebelhaus, and added, "He took blood from the victim." Giebelhaus said nothing. He stared at Bletcher, then at Frank, finally nodding at the gaunt man. "I'll put it out on the air," he said, and hurried out. Bletcher waited until he was gone, then he turned once more to Frank, eyebrows raised. "Killer's passing judgment," Frank said. His tone held absolute certainty. "He's probably testing that blood and carrying out his death sentences on the afflicted." Fletcher lifted his hands in a futile gesture. "So how are we going to catch him?" "Stake out the crime scenes. Killers are prone to revisiting them. Get everyone you can spare out there in those woods. Get his picture out. Check any medical facilities that handles blood." Fletcher nodded. "Right. We've already got word out to the labs." Frank sighed and got to his feet. His clothes were filthy, stained with dirt and blood, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I've got to call Catherine." Fletcher pushed the telephone across his desk toward him. As Frank reached for the receiver, he said in a strained voice, 20 years, Frank. 20 years. I don't think I've ever seen anything as terrifying as what I saw tonight." Frank met his gaze. Fletcher's eyes wide as though still seeing what he had beheld in the forest. "Ever see your kid lying in bed in an emergency ward?" Fletcher took a deep breath, finally nodding in agreement. As Frank started punching in a number, he rose and started for the door, but stopped before stepping into the corridor. "It made sense to me out there tonight, Frank. What it does to you, what it did to you, why you quit." Frank stopped dialing. He stared across the room at the detective and slowly replaced the handset in its cradle. He sighed and ran a hand across his exhausted face. "The cruelty, the unspeakable crimes. It all becomes numbing, depersonalized, common." He spoke as though he had the words memorized, as though he had repeated them 100 times before. "After a while, you stop feeling anything." Fletcher shrugged. "What was it then?" Frank sighed and eased himself onto the edge of Fletcher's desk. "I was on a serial case in Minnesota. Killer's name was Ed Cuffle. He would choose a neighborhood, go up to a door, all totally at random. The door was unlocked. He considered it an invitation to go in and slaughter anybody home. Then he'd take Polaroids of his victims and send them to the police." He took a deep breath and went on. "That's how serial killers work. That's why they're serial killers. They get a rush from the murder itself, the violation. But then they get another rush from not getting caught. So they do it again and again. It's an addiction, but it's how we catch them eventually. Because they can't stop killing, and a lot of the time they can't stop leaving a trail, toying with the police like a cat, playing with its prey, getting off on it. The danger, the threat of getting caught. That's why it was so difficult to get Cuffle. The utter randomness of his M.O., there was no logic to it. Like breaking a code devised by a madman. It took us months, but we finally caught the guy. He's doing a triple life sentence. He finished, staring down at his hands. Fletcher waited to see if there was more. When Frank said nothing, he asked, "And that was it?" Frank lifted his head. His eyes were burning, haunted. A year later, I reached into my mailbox, picking up my mail. Inside there was an envelope, addressed to me. No return. Inside. His voice grew strained, as though he could barely pronounce the words. Inside are Polaroids of Catherine at the supermarket, Jordan at school, and suddenly the psychic Novocaine wore off. The numbness became paralyzing fear. Fletcher gazed at his old friend with pity and horror. "Did you ever find who sent it?" "No. I couldn't even leave the house. Why go to work to protect others if you can't even protect your own family? Jordan was a miracle to us. The doctors told us we would never be able to conceive. How could I live with myself, knowing she was at risk? But you beat it, Frank." Fletcher shook his head admiringly. "You beat it. How?" "I was approached by a group of men and women who helped me understand the nature of my facility." He hesitated. "My gift." Fletcher nodded, encouraging him to go on. "This Millennium group." "Yes." "They really believe this stuff, then? Nostradamus and Revelations? Destruction of the world?" Frank stared at him. A full minute passed before he replied. "They think we can't just sit back and hope for a happy ending." He reached for the telephone receiver and picked it up. Once again began punching in the hospital number. Fletcher watched him. When nothing else was forthcoming, he turned and left. Frank stared after him, frowning as the phone bleated a busy signal. He pressed the receiver to get another dial tone, but as soon as he did, the phone rang. "Bob Fletcher's office," Frank said, glancing at the door to see if Fletcher was there. "Bob?" A man's voice. "No, he just stepped out." The caller made an impatient sound. "Can you give him some information for me? It's urgent." Quickly, Frank swung around, scrabbling at Fletcher's desk for paper. Let me get a pen, okay? "Tell him we think we tracked down those blood samples he's looking for. They were sent to a lab the Seattle PD uses downtown." In Frank's ears was a faint humming. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to grow faint. He swallowed, his mouth flooded with the taste of bile and copper. "Where were they sent from?" he asked, his voice dry. "Well, that's just it." The caller's tone wavered between frustration and bewilderment. "They were sent through the same channels as the PD. The same courier service. Intra-office." Intra-office. Frank stared at the door, his mouth suddenly dry. Without saying goodbye, he set the phone back in its cradle and stood. The room round him seemed to swim. Chairs, and desks, and bookshelves taking on the liquid contours of a drowned forest. The rotting piers and alleys of a city being inundated by a tide, so immense and fast-moving and inescapable that one could only look on in a sort of awe, a sort of transcendent horror that this was the way the world ended. The smell of sewage filled the room, burning petroleum, scorched hair and flesh. Dust motes spinning slowly above Fletcher's desk lamp coalesced into the fluid silhouette of a woman writhing seductively. behind a glass window, a headless corpse encased in black plastic. "Bob?" His voice rang out harshly through the empty office. He ran out into the hallway, looking fruitlessly back and forth. "Bob?" There was no answer. Heart roaring, he began to race down the hall until he reached the freight elevator. It was several minutes before it arrived. The heavy doors slid open with excruciating slowness, and he leaped inside, furiously punching buttons until at last the doors closed again. Then the elevator descended with even more agonizing languor. Frank stood with his back pressed against the far wall, watching the lights flicker in the LCD readout. 3, 2, lobby, parking level, until his destination scrolled across the screen in bright red letters: morgue. He was out before the doors had fully opened, hurrying down the desolate windowless corridor, his footsteps resounding loudly on the cold tile floor. He pushed through the double doors leading into the morgue, ignoring the warning signs plastered to doors and walls. Authorized personnel only. Biohazard alert. Please observe all safety regulations. Icily refrigerated air washed over him. Sweetness of lactose and formaldehyde, alcohol and disinfectant, and the faintest, pungent bass note of decay. All around him stretched that gruesome archipelago of stainless steel gurneys, their burden of cadavers and body bags forming ominous peaks where they were shoved anonymously against walls. His feet clattered across a series of drains in the floor, narrow, sloping channels leading from the autopsy tables built into the far wall. In front of one of these, a white-robed man was bent over a glittering array of scalpels and lenses and briskly efficient-looking surgical knives. Beside him on the table, a pallid, bloated form lay exposed, its chest cavity open to reveal ribs, like the spars of a ship. "Excuse me." Frank drew up next to him, breathless. "I'm looking for the head pathologist, Massey, Kurt Massey." "Sorry, he's not here." The man barely glanced at Frank, intent on his work. "His desk's over there. You could leave a—" But Frank did not hear his words. Frank heard other words. A hoarse whisper repeating, "I want to see you dance. I want to see you dance," over and over again. He stared at the other man, taking in his gloved hands, his rapt expression as he stooped over the bloodless corpse. "Message." The man's voice trailed off. He straightened and turned, for the first time looked at Frank standing behind him. In that instant, their eyes locked, as they had on the path in Volunteer Park. And behind those eyes, Frank saw it all, as exposed as the viscera of the corpse he was dissecting. Tuesday's body in flames. Calamity's torso carefully arranged, with arms crossed upon her blood-soaked chest. The dreadful lipless mouth of another corpse, mouth frozen in a rigor of unspeakable horror where the body was imprisoned in its crude coffin. And Frank saw himself there as well, his own face mirrored in the killer's, his own features, as the Frenchman saw them right now, the gaunt, avenging angel come to take vengeance upon the bloody prophet. "No!" the Frenchman shouted, his features contorted with the anguish of being discovered. With one swift motion, he grabbed a knife from the table, its blade long and serrated, designed for sawing through bone and muscle. He charged Frank, the knife whistling through the air as he slashed at his throat. Frank dodged, sidestepping behind a body on a gurney. With all his strength, he pushed the gurney at the Frenchman, recoiling as the man leaned over the body and the knife swiped dangerously close to Frank's face. Then he shoved at the gurney again, forcing the Frenchman back against the metal counter behind him. "Who are you to condemn me?" the man shrieked, his eyes wild. "Put that knife down, and we'll talk," Frank responded, trying to keep his voice calm. But the Frenchman's answer to this was to thrust the knife toward Frank, inches from his cheek. Frank leaned forward, pushing all his weight against the gurney, keeping the Frenchman pinned to the counter. The killer squirmed, trying to escape. "They're the guilty," he shouted. "You know that." Frank shook his head. "Put down the knife." "I took the responsibility," the killer went on, and the words coming relentlessly now. "Somebody had to. You see them." He gestured crazily with the knife. "Out there where Satan has his throne. The Great Plague. Somebody has to do it. Nobody ever asks. Who takes responsibility?" Frank listened to his ranting, staring at him with piercing eyes as he tried to calculate the madman's next move. The door was far away. All the weapons, all the instruments of the coroner's craft were on the counter behind the Frenchman. Quickly, Frank tried to determine if he could reach one when, without warning, the Frenchman once more lunged at his face. Frank went reeling backwards. The Frenchman shoved the gurney, sent it wheeling toward Frank so that it struck him and sent him tumbling to the ground. Above him, the gurney began to topple. Vainly, Frank tried to spin away, but it was too late. The gurney fell, and with it, its grotesque burden, the body falling on top of Frank and pinning him to the floor. He tried frantically to push it off, to escape, but then the Frenchman was there, bending over Frank's face with a knife to Frank's throat. "This is prophecy," he hissed. Only the cadaver was there as any bulwark between the two of them. "The final judgment and victory. This is the way it ends, but you know that." His mouth twisted into a vicious smile. "You see it, don't you? You see it all, just like I do." Frank stared into his distorted face and knew that it was true. That the killer saw him, recognized his vision, just as Frank had recognized the Frenchman's. "You know the end is coming," the Frenchman cried. "The 1,000 years is over." Suddenly he drove the knife downward at Frank. Gasping, Frank pushed the corpse toward him so that it caught the blow, then kicked out, trying to slither away on his back. But the Frenchman was too fast. Tugging the knife free, he scrambled toward Frank, raising the knife to land his last fatal blow. "You think you're the one to stop it?" he cried. "You think it can be stopped?" He drove the blade down, aimed so that it would impale Frank's heart. Frank gasped, struggling futilely to escape, when a thunderous explosion tore through the room. Above him, the Frenchman's face crumbled into shock as his body was blown backwards. Blood spurted from his chest as he slammed against the floor. Frank twisted to see Bob Bletcher, standing just inside the double doors leading into the morgue. Vapor surrounded the sidearm he kept aimed at the fallen man. "Frank," he said, making a sideways motion with his head. Frank got to his knees. Looking back at the Frenchman, he was curled into a ball, clutching his chest. Blood soaked his white jacket and latex gloves, oozed from his mouth as he stared at Frank with a strangely intent gaze. "You can't stop it," he murmured, his voice growing faint. For one last moment, his eyes held Frank's. In their icy depths, the gaunt man saw imprecation and warning. "You can't stop it." Several days later, Catherine stood in the kitchen, hastily finishing her morning coffee. Frank had gone out earlier, pleading an urgent errand and leaving her to deal with Jordan. The girl had been released the day before. They were still waiting for results from the battery of tests she'd been given, but the doctors assured Catherine and Frank that she was out of any immediate danger. "Children do have seizures sometimes," he told them at their last meeting, "and I know that it can be terrifying for a parent to witness one, or its aftermath, But as long as it's associated with something in particular, like a high fever, a seizure of this sort may not be anything to worry about. But we'll wait for the test results. Rule out anything that might be worrisome. So they'd brought her home. And Catherine had gone ahead and arranged for a job interview this morning, an interview she was going to miss if Frank didn't get back soon. She put down her coffee mug and, for the 100th time, adjusted her skirt, smoothing her hair in its unaccustomed, tidy braid down the back of her linen suit. Then she picked up her earrings where she'd left them on the counter, alongside more copies of her resume and the job materials the headhunter had sent her when she was still in D.C. "Catherine." She whirled to see Frank poking his head between the swinging doors that led into the dining room. She smiled. "I'm glad you're home. I'm going to be late for my interview." She finished putting in her earrings, then glanced back at her husband. Her expression changed from relief to curiosity as he continued to stand there in the same awkward pose, only his head showing. "Frank, what are you doing?" He whispered, "Where's Jordan?" "She's up in her room. What are you doing, Frank?" Reassured that the coast was clear, he pushed the doors open and stepped into the kitchen. Bundled in his jacket was a tiny black and white ball of fur. "Oh, my God!" Catherine raised her hands in delight and rushed to him. "Look at this." He held the puppy out to her, and she took it in her arms. It squirmed and whimpered, threatening to lick off all her carefully applied makeup. "It's a border collie," Frank explained. "They were all out of basset hounds. Come on." He took the puppy from her and gestured for her to go upstairs first. She did so, and Frank followed, whispering hush to the wriggling bundle in his arms. At the top of the stairs, he could hear Jordan's excited voice. "What is it? Tell me, what is it?" "Close your eyes, honey. Come on. It's a special surprise for being such a big, brave girl." He waited outside her room, peering in to make sure her eyes were shut. His daughter was still in bed in her pajamas, a toy bulldog in her lap, eyes squeezed tight. Beside her, Catherine looked over at him and nodded, and he stepped inside. "I think someone's trying to peek," Catherine scolded. "What is it?" Jordan cried breathlessly. Frank quietly crossed the room to her bed and put the puppy in her lap. Jordan's eyes flew open. She squealed in delight as the puppy lunged at her, eagerly licking her face. "Oh, Daddy!" She hugged the puppy to her, laughing joyously. "What's its name?" Frank sat on the bed and smiled. "He doesn't have one yet." "Can I name him?" Frank nodded. "He's yours, isn't he?" The puppy settled into Jordan's arms. His daughter sighed blissfully. "Oh, Daddy, I love him so much." Catherine reached to take Frank's hands. She gazed at him, her eyes tearing. "Well, so much for the professional woman's makeup," she said. "I'll be right back." So Frank sat there with his daughter, watching her play with the new puppy. Sun slanting in through the windows, the smell of fresh coffee percolating through the house. And for a little while he was purely happy, playing make-believe. "Well," he said at last, his own eyes tearing, I think I'll let you two get acquainted." He patted Jordan's leg, tousled the puppy's fur, and went into the hall. On his way downstairs, he poked his head into the bathroom, where Catherine was putting on fresh lipstick. "Good luck with the interview." "Thanks." She turned and gave him a smile, almost as blissful as Jordan's. "It really is going to be okay, Frank, isn't it? All of this," she gestured, taking in the room, the little girl in her bedroom with the yapping puppy, the Edenic yellow house itself. "All this is just the beginning?" Frank smiled back. "I think you're right," he said, and went downstairs. At the top of the steps, the morning mail sat on the floor beneath the mail slot in the front door. He paused to pick it up, sorting through junk mail, magazines, flyers, bills forwarded from D.C., then halting when he came to something else. It was a letter addressed to him, his name neatly typed on a label, and beneath it their current address, Frank Black, 1910 Ezekiel Drive. The letter had not been forwarded. It had no return address. His heart began to race as he opened it, slid his fingers inside to feel the familiar, slick surface of several Polaroids. Before he could remove them, Catherine came bounding downstairs. "I think you've already got a mess to clean up there," she announced, cocking a thumb toward the second floor. "Right," Frank said numbly. She picked up her purse and briefcase. "Wish me luck," she said, kissing him, then noting his tension. "What?" He looked at her, the sun striking her hair, all the fatigue and worry of the last few days erased. "Nothing," he said. "Be careful, okay?" She nodded, smiling, straightened her jacket, and walked outside. Frank watched her go down the sidewalk to her car. As she drove off, he looked down once more at the envelope. With shaking hands, he opened it, removed the Polaroids. They were pictures of Catherine and Jordan, the two of them in the back of the Cherokee. Jordan strapped into her booster seat. Catherine in front of a revolving door, slightly out of focus as she rushed to get inside out of the rain. A blurry view of Jordan's head. And last of all, Catherine and Jordan glimpsed through busy traffic on a city street, the two of them holding hands, waiting for the light to change. Staring at the photo, Frank's breath came in ragged bursts. Felt the pressure beginning once more inside his skull, as with shaking hands, he drew the Polaroid closer to his face, and saw, behind the fragile images of his wife and daughter, caught unawares at a random moment, the distinct outline of a bright yellow car, a logo cheerfully emblazoned on its door. "Seattle City Cab. We'll always find you, wherever you are."